She was 8 months pregnant, on her feet for 11 hours, and they told her she was a liability. The order came down at 7:43 in the evening. Clock out, go home, you're done. Not because she'd made an error, not because a patient had complained, because a supervisor with soft hands and a corporate title decided that a visibly pregnant nurse had no place in an emergency trauma bay. The staff watched. Nobody argued, and Emily Voss quietly removed her badge, set it on the counter, and turned toward the exit. That was the moment a retired military K-9 sat down in front of her and refused to move. Before we go any further, if stories like this one stop you mid-scroll and make you feel something real, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, this channel brings you cinematic stories about overlooked people who turned out to be anything but ordinary. Drop a like if you're staying until the end, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Harlow Regional Medical Center sat at the edge of Denton Falls, Colorado, the kind of mid-sized city that was proud of its hospital the way small towns are proud of their high school football teams, loudly and without much scrutiny. The building itself had been renovated twice in the last decade, the lobby freshly tiled, the administrative offices fitted with standing desks and motivational posters about teamwork. The emergency department, by contrast, looked exactly like what it was. A place where things went wrong faster than anyone planned for. Emily Voss had worked the ER for 4 years. Before that, she'd been something else entirely. But nobody at Harlow Regional knew that. They knew her as the nurse who stayed late without being asked, who remembered which patients were afraid of needles, who could start a line on a collapsed vein when the doctors had already given up. She was 34, white, with the kind of steadiness in her eyes that either came from years of experience or from something harder to name. Patients sensed it immediately. Colleagues respected it quietly. Administration barely noticed her. That changed the morning she came in visibly, undeniably 8 months pregnant. Not because anyone was unkind at first. They asked the obligatory questions. How are you feeling? Have you talked to HR? Are you sure you want to keep working? Emily said she was fine. She'd cleared it with her OB. She was staying. The charge nurse, a man named Douglas Pratt, who had the energy of someone perpetually running for a middle management position he would never quite reach, had looked at her belly and then at the trauma board and said nothing. Which was its own kind of statement. The shift that Thursday evening started at 3 and was already chaotic by 4. A multi-vehicle accident on Route 9 had sent 4 patients through the doors inside 20 minutes. Emily moved through it the way she always did, methodically, without drama, listening to the monitors the way some people listen to music, reading the room with the peripheral awareness of someone trained to notice everything and react to nothing prematurely. She managed 2 IVs, assisted with a chest tube, talked a panicking 17-year-old through a dislocated shoulder with enough calm that the kid actually laughed once before they sedated him. By 6:30, the rush had thinned. Emily was charting at the nurse's station when the sliding doors opened and a man walked in with a dog. The man was somewhere in his late 40s, built like someone who used to be in excellent physical condition and still carried the memory of it in the way he moved, deliberate, low center, no wasted motion. His jaw was heavy with 2 days of gray stubble, and he wore a canvas jacket despite the warmth. The kind of jacket with too many pockets that people either bought for camping or because old habits from other lives died hard. He was holding a retractable leash, and at the end of it walked a Belgian Malinois of considerable age. The dog's muzzle had gone silver. One ear sat slightly lower than the other, an old injury healed crooked. It moved with the careful gait of an animal whose joints had earned their rest, but its eyes were still sharp, dark and mobile, scanning the room with a focus that had nothing to do with curiosity. "Sir," the intake receptionist looked up. "We don't allow—" "He's a certified service animal." The man set a laminated card on the counter without being asked. "Retired military working dog. His name's Rex. I need someone to look at my shoulder. Possible separation. I've had it before. I know what it feels like." The receptionist looked at the card, then at the dog, then back at the card. "I'll need you to take a seat and wait for triage." "That's fine." He picked up the card and moved toward the waiting area, the dog walking close at his left heel, the way working dogs move. Not like a pet, not wandering, but positioned, deliberate. Emily noticed them the way she noticed most things, briefly, categorically, filed and set aside. Older male, probable rotator cuff or AC joint, non-urgent. The dog was well behaved and the man was calm. She went back to her chart. What happened next took less than 30 seconds and didn't make sense until later. Rex stopped walking. The man tugged the leash once, gently. Rex, come on. The dog didn't move. He was facing the nurse's station, facing Emily specifically. And he'd gone very still in the particular way that working dogs go still when they've found what they were looking for. Not aggressive, not uncertain, locked. Emily looked up from her screen. The dog was staring at her. It wasn't the stare of an animal that recognized a person, though something in its eyes suggested recognition of a different kind. It was assessing. It was reading her the way a physician reads a patient before the chart ever opens. Sorry about him. The man walked closer. Rex, heel. Rex didn't heel. He padded forward 3 steps toward the nurse's station and sat down. Then he made a sound. Not a bark. Something lower, more insistent. A sound with information in it. He doesn't usually do this, the man said. He was watching the dog, not Emily, and his voice had changed register slightly, less casual. He really doesn't usually do this. It's okay. Emily pushed back from her chair slightly, instinctively giving the dog space without moving away entirely. Something in her body remembered not to run from a working dog. She wasn't sure where that memory came from. What's his name? Rex. He was a military working dog, 12 years, 2 deployments, retired 3 years ago. He lives with me. The man paused. I'm Nolan Marsh. Emily? She looked at the dog. What branch? Nolan blinked. Most civilians didn't ask that. Army, both of us. Rex whined again, soft, sustained, directed entirely at Emily's midsection. Nolan went very quiet. Emily noticed. Something wrong? I don't know yet. Nolan crouched beside the dog, one hand resting on Rex's back, and studied the animal's posture with the attention of someone reading a language he'd spent years learning. Was he trained for medical alerts? I have no idea. You're the one who... I know he was trained for explosives, patrol, and building clearance, Nolan said. What I'm asking is whether he was ever cross-trained. Some dogs pick it up on their own, especially after years of exposure. He looked up at Emily. How are you feeling? She almost laughed. I'm fine. I'm 8 months pregnant, so I feel like I'm carrying a bowling ball in a backpack, but I'm fine. Headache? She paused. A little. It's been a long shift. Vision? Why are you swelling in your hands, feet, more than usual? Emily looked at him for a moment. She was a nurse. She knew the list he was running. She'd run it herself on other people 100 times. A little more than usual, she said carefully. But I'm 8 months pregnant, Mr. Marsh. That's normal up to a point, yeah. He stood. His voice was flat and certain. Has anyone checked your blood pressure today? The question landed differently than it should have, because the honest answer was no. She'd been in motion since 3 o'clock, and there had been no reason, no specific reason, for anyone to check the blood pressure of a nurse who was on her feet and functioning. She checked her patients. She didn't think of herself as one. I'm fine, she said again. Rex whined a third time. It was different from the first two. Lower, more urgent, the sound an instrument makes when something is genuinely wrong. Nolan looked at the dog. Then he looked at Emily, and something in his face had gone from curious to certain in a way that made the back of her neck tighten. She didn't get the chance to say anything else, because Douglas Pratt chose that moment to appear from the corridor with a tablet under his arm and the particular expression of a man who had decided to solve a problem by eliminating it. Emily? He stopped. His eyes moved from her to Nolan to the dog and back again, settling into the mild irritation of someone who'd arrived at a scene he hadn't been invited to. What's the situation here? Patient is waiting for triage, Emily said. Service animal, retired military working dog. There's a card on file. I'm not asking about the dog. Pratt looked at her directly. I've been meaning to come talk to you. Can we step aside for a moment? Emily followed him 3 steps down the corridor. Rex's head swiveled to track her. Nolan's hand rested on the dog's back, but he didn't try to redirect him. Pratt had his management voice on, the one that was calibrated to sound reasonable while delivering something that wasn't. Listen, Emily, I know you've been putting in the hours, and I appreciate that. Everyone does. But we're moving into a heavier triage window tonight, and I need my staff fully operational. I am fully operational. You're 8 months pregnant. I'm aware of that, yes. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the outcome. I've spoken with Dr. Hargrove, and we both feel that given where you are in your pregnancy, it would be best. Best for who? Best for you and for the department if you wrapped up your shift a little early tonight. We have coverage. You can use the PTO. The paperwork is already started. Douglas, she kept her voice level. I have active charts. I have 2 patients in Bay 4 and 6 who I'm tracking. I can't just. I'll reassign them. He was already pulling up his tablet. It's not a disciplinary matter. It's a safety precaution. Whose safety? He didn't answer that, which told her everything. This isn't the right time, he said instead. You know that. Look at yourself. It was the last 3 words that did it, not with anger. She didn't have the energy for anger, and she was too tired to perform it convincingly anyway. She just looked at him, really looked at him, the way she looked at patients who were telling her something other than the truth, and she nodded once. Okay, she said. He seemed surprised she'd given in that easily. He nodded back, businesslike, already moving on. I'll have Sandra cover your bays. Clock out whenever you're ready. And Emily, he paused. Take care of yourself. She turned back toward the nurse's station to get her things. Rex was on his feet. The dog had moved from where he'd been sitting to a position directly in front of the path back to the main corridor. Not blocking her aggressively, not growling, but standing square, his weight distributed, and he was looking at her with the kind of focused attention that was not an animal waiting to play. It was an animal that had decided something. Rex. Nolan's voice was quiet. Easy. Rex didn't move. He does this when he doesn't want someone to leave, Nolan said. He was looking at Emily, not the dog. He did it once with a soldier who was symptomatic after an IED blast and didn't know it yet. Wouldn't let the man get in the truck, sat right in front of the door. He paused. The soldier had a subdural bleed, made it because they caught it in time. Emily stopped walking. She had her bag over one shoulder and her coat in her other hand, and she stopped walking and she looked at the dog sitting in front of her, and she thought about the headache that had been sitting behind her left eye for the last 2 hours, dull and persistent, the kind she'd been chalking up to the shift and the fluorescence and the general business of being enormously pregnant. She thought about how her rings had been tight this morning. She'd left them on the nightstand. She thought about the floaters she'd blinked away twice while charting, chalking them up to screen fatigue. She was a nurse. She knew what those things meant individually. She had simply not put them together. Douglas. Her voice was different now, quieter, not shaky. She didn't shake, but stripped of the performance of being fine. I need someone to take my blood pressure. He had turned back toward the corridor. He stopped. Emily, right now. She set her bag on the counter. Get me a cuff. The irritation on his face was visible for a moment before he recalibrated into something that looked more like patience. Emily, I just told you, you're done for the... Douglas. She turned to look at him fully. Either someone takes my blood pressure in the next 2 minutes, or I walk back into Bay 4 and do it myself. Your choice. The waiting room had gone quiet. 2 people in chairs had looked up from their phones. The intake receptionist was very still. Pratt exhaled through his nose. Fine. He flagged down a passing nurse, a younger woman named Abby, whose eyes widened slightly when she read the room. Take her BP. Humor her so we can get her out the door. Abby got a cuff and a portable monitor. Emily sat in the chair at the nurse's station, her coat still in her hand, Rex sitting 6 feet away watching with those ancient, certain eyes. The cuff inflated, beeped. Abby read the number. And her face changed. Not dramatically. She was professional enough to control it. But it changed. Something around the eyes and jaw that happens when a person reads something that shouldn't be there. What is it? Emily said. It wasn't a question. Abby showed her the screen, 168 over 112. Emily looked at the number for 3 seconds. Then she set her coat down very carefully on the counter. Get Dr. Hargrove, she said. Her voice was calm in the specific way that emergency nurses are calm. Not because the situation isn't serious, but because calm is the only useful thing to be when it is. Tell her I have a blood pressure of 168 over 112 and I'm 33 weeks and 4 days. Tell her my rings didn't fit this morning and I've had a headache since 1500. Tell her I've had visual disturbances. She looked up at Abby. Tell her I need a urine dip for protein and I need it right now. Abby moved fast. Pratt stood in the corridor with his tablet and his certainty dissolving in real time, the expression on his face, the one people get when they realize the problem they tried to manage has turned into a crisis they have to survive. In the waiting area, Nolan Marsh had not sat down. He was standing at the edge of the room, still holding Rex's leash, watching. The dog had not moved from his position near the nurse's station. His tail was low, not tucked, held horizontal, careful. His eyes tracked Emily like the second hand of a clock. Dr. Hargrove came out of the corridor in under 4 minutes. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and the unflappable quality of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by fewer. She looked at Abby's handwritten note, looked at Emily, and skipped all the preamble. When did the headache start? 14:52, Emily said. I remember because I noted it mentally when I looked at the monitor in Bay 2. Visual symptoms? 2 episodes of bilateral floaters, short duration. I attributed them to screen exposure. Epigastric pain? Emily paused. Some. Hargrove's face was completely still, which was its own kind of information. How long? On and off for a few hours. I thought it was... Emily stopped. I thought it was hunger. Okay. Hargrove turned to Abby. Get her into Bay 1. I want a urine dip in 5 minutes, full panel, and I want her on a monitor. Call OB now. She looked at Pratt, who was still standing in the corridor like a man waiting for someone to tell him what to do. Douglas, clear Bay 1. It's already... Clear it. He moved. Emily stood up from the chair and for one moment, just one, the room tilted slightly, a soft, vertiginous shift that was there and then gone. She blinked. Steadied. No one saw it except Nolan, who was watching from 12 feet away with the attention of someone trained not to look away from important things. Rex made the low sound again. Not alert now. Something quieter. Something closer to concern. She walked into Bay 1 under her own power and sat on the edge of the gurney and looked at the ceiling tiles and thought, in the specific way that nurses think when they are the patient, about everything she knew about the condition assembling itself around her. And she thought about the fact that she was 33 weeks and 4 days, and the baby had moved twice today, and twice was less than usual, and she thought about a lot of things she was going to have to stop thinking about and hand over to someone else's competence, which was the hardest part of being a nurse on the wrong side of the gurney. The urine came back in 4 minutes. Dr. Hargrove looked at the strip. She didn't say what it read because she didn't need to. She was already talking to the phone in her hand, standing in the doorway of Bay 1, and her voice had the particular velocity of someone bypassing normal channels. This is Hargrove. I need OB attending in the ER. I have a nurse in Bay 1 with BP of 168/112, positive proteinuria at 4+, clinical picture consistent with severe preeclampsia at 33 weeks. She listened for 2 seconds. No, I don't want a consult. I need a physician, right now. In the corridor outside, Pratt had his phone out. I was talking to someone. Emily could hear the registers of it through the curtain, the specific defensive cadence of a man building a narrative about what he had and hadn't done in the last 40 minutes. Rex was in the waiting area, but his head was oriented toward Bay 1 in the particular way that working dogs orient when they cannot go where they need to be. Nolan stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on the dog's side, watching the corridor with an expression that wasn't anxiety. He was past anxiety, or had learned to process it as information rather than noise. He was reading the hospital the way he'd learned to read other environments. He was cataloging. The OB attending arrived at a near run, a tall man named Dr. Reyes, whose air of mild impatience collapsed immediately when he reviewed Hargrove's numbers. He leaned into Bay 1 and looked at Emily with the direct attention of someone who had already recalibrated. Emily, I'm ordering a full magnesium protocol, and we need to talk about delivery timing. I know, she said. You understand what that means? Yes. Your baby could be delivered tonight. I know. She folded her hands in her lap. They were visibly swollen. She could see it now that she was looking for it. She's going to need NICU. What's the unit capacity tonight? Reyes blinked. Even now, she was running the logistics. We're in good shape, he said, softening slightly. Let's take care of you first. We'll take care of her together. The magnesium drip started. Hargrove stayed close. Abby checked the monitors twice in the first 10 minutes. checking the numbers the way you check something you want to be different. From the corridor, Douglas Pratt looked through the bay curtain once. Emily didn't look at him. She didn't need to. What she needed was to stay very still and let the machines and the medications do the work. She could not do herself, which was the thing no one who had never been a patient truly understood about the other side of the gurney. Outside in the waiting area, a man and an old silver-muzzled dog sat beside each other in the blue plastic chairs. Nolan Marsh had his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and Rex had his head resting on Nolan's knee, and neither of them was going anywhere. The hospital went about its business around them. Phones rang. A child cried in triage. A gurney rolled past. The overhead lights hummed their indifferent frequency. Rex's ear lifted. Just one ear. The left, the crooked one that had healed wrong. He raised his head from Nolan's knee and turned toward the main entrance, and he went perfectly still, the way he went still when he detected something significant. Not a medical alert now, something different, something in a different register, something he recognized from a long time ago, and a very different kind of building. Nolan looked toward the entrance too. The automatic doors slid open. 3 people walked in, and even in civilian clothes, even without insignia, even with their weapons out of sight, the way they moved was not civilian. It was never civilian, not really, not when you'd spent long enough in proximity to people who moved that way. They moved like people accustomed to being the most prepared individuals in any room they entered. They stopped at the reception desk. The lead one, a woman, compact, late 30s, something in her jaw that suggested she had been delivering bad news in controlled tones for long enough that it had become architecture, showed something to the receptionist. The receptionist looked at what she was shown and immediately reached for her phone. Rex's tail moved once. Not wagging, something more deliberate. Recognition. Nolan leaned forward slowly in his chair, and the woman at the reception desk turned and her eyes moved across the waiting room with a professional sweep that wasn't random, that was reading the room for something specific. And when her eyes found Rex, when they found the old silver-muzzled dog sitting in the plastic chair beside a man in a canvas jacket, her expression changed. Not much, just enough. She looked at Nolan. He looked back. She turned back to the receptionist and said something that made the receptionist pick up the phone a second time. Down the hall, in Bay 1, a monitor alarmed briefly. A single tone, then silence, then the steady percussion of 2 heartbeats reasserting themselves on the screen. The woman from the entrance started walking toward the corridor. She moved like someone who had learned to cover ground efficiently without looking like she was hurrying, which was a different skill than simply walking fast, and the distinction mattered in places where panic was contagious. Her name was Reeves. She didn't offer the first name, and nobody asked. She had a federal ID and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around her arrival, and she stood at the entrance of Bay 1 for exactly 2 seconds before Dr. Hargrove stepped out to intercept her. "This is a restricted treatment area," Hargrove said, not unkindly, just clearly. "I understand that." Reeves held up the ID again. "I need to know the condition of the patient in this bay. And I need to know why a federal officer is in my emergency department asking about one of my nurses. She's a nurse here." "Yes." Something moved across Reeves's face. Not surprise exactly, more like a calculation completing itself. She looked at the curtain, then back at Hargrove. "How serious?" Hargrove studied her for a moment. "Severe preeclampsia. We're stabilizing. OB is with her." "Is she conscious?" "She's alert, yes. She's a nurse. She understands exactly what's happening to her, which makes this both easier and harder than you'd think." Hargrove folded her arms. "Now, who are you and why are you here?" "I'm not able to give you a full briefing in a hallway." "Then give me enough of one that I can decide whether to call security." Reeves looked at her steadily. "The patient in that bay, does she have a scar on her left forearm? Linear, about 4 centimeters, runs parallel to the ulna." Hargrove's expression didn't change. "I haven't examined her forearm." "No, but you've had her on a monitor for—" Reeves checked her watch. "Approximately 18 minutes. Your staff has. Ask them." Hargrove turned. Abby was standing 3 feet away, pretending to review a chart. "Abby." Abby looked up. "There's a scar," she said quietly. "I noticed it when I placed the IV. I didn't think anything of it." Reeves nodded once, the nod of a person whose suspicion has been confirmed. I need 5 minutes with her. After that, whatever your medical team needs to do, we stay out of the way. You have my word. Your word doesn't carry much weight when I don't know your name. Special Agent Dana Reeves, Defense Intelligence, and Dr. Hargrove. Dr. Hargrove, I understand I'm in your house. I'm asking for 5 minutes. What happens in that room, she gestured toward the curtain, is yours. I just need to confirm something. Hargrove held the eye contact for another 3 seconds. Then she stepped aside. Reeves pushed through the curtain. Emily was propped at roughly 30 degrees on the gurney, 2 monitors running, the magnesium drip going, her hands folded in her lap in the deliberate way of someone managing themselves consciously. She looked up when the curtain moved, and her expression went through 3 things in rapid sequence: recognition, calculation, and a kind of resigned inevitability that suggested she had spent some portion of her life waiting for a door to open and find something like this on the other side of it. Hello, Emily said. Staff Sergeant Voss? Reeves stopped 2 feet from the gurney. Her voice had changed from the one she'd used in the hallway. Less official, more direct. Or is it Voss now? Last name on file was different. I got married, and then divorced. Emily looked at the ceiling for a moment. So it's Voss again. Has been for 2 years. We've been looking for you for about 14 months. I know. Reeves blinked. You know. You're not the first person from that world who's walked through a door looking for me. You're just the first one who came into an ER while I was on a magnesium drip. Emily looked at her hands. Could we do this after I know my daughter is going to be okay? I'm not going anywhere. Literally. Something in Reeves loosened slightly. Not unprofessional, just human. I'm not here to bring you in for anything. I need you to understand that. Then why are you here? Reeves was quiet for a moment. Operation Iron Ridge. The room went very still in the way that rooms go still when a significant word enters them. Emily's jaw tightened once, briefly. That's classified. The classification was partially lifted 6 weeks ago. There's a review board. Reeves paused. There are 17 families who've been waiting for answers for 4 years. And there are some people who've been waiting for recognition that was owed to them a long time ago. Emily said nothing. Her monitor beeped once, steady. The magnesium drip ran. We didn't know where you were, Reeves said. We found the marriage record, then the divorce, then a nursing license in Colorado, then... She gestured around. Tonight, a colleague flagged the name on a hospital database during a routine cross-check. I was in Denver. She paused. I drove fast. You and 2 others. 2 others, yes. Emily looked at the curtain. The man in the waiting room. Nolan Marsh. He's not part of this. He's former Delta Force, Reeves said. We ran him when we ran you. Emily stared at her. You ran him. Anyone in proximity. Standard. She paused. His record is clean, decorated. He's been out for 3 years. He came in with a hurt shoulder. I know. My colleague is arranging for him to be seen. Reeves folded her hands behind her back. Staff Sergeant Voss, I'm going to need your medical team to allow us access to the corridor outside this bay for the next few hours. We'll stay out of the way. But I need to be here. Why? Reeves hesitated for precisely 1 second. Because when the review board made the initial findings public last week, 3 of the men you pulled out of that valley sent letters to the Oversight Committee. 3 separate letters, 3 separate men who hadn't spoken to each other in 4 years, all describing the same event and the same person. She stopped. We had to find you. Emily closed her eyes. She opened them again. My blood pressure is 168 over 112, and I'm about to potentially deliver my daughter 8 weeks early, she said. Can we? Yes. Reeves stepped back toward the curtain. We can wait. She paused, half through the curtain. For what it's worth, I've read the file. All of it. Emily said nothing. Your daughter's going to be okay, Reeves said. It was a strange thing to say. She had no medical basis for it, but she said it with the conviction of someone who had decided it was true. She left. Emily looked at the ceiling and breathed, slowly, the way she'd trained herself to breathe in situations where breathing was the only thing she could fully control. The magnesium was already working on her. She could feel the warmth of it, the slight heaviness behind her eyes. It was medication that worked and made you feel terrible in the working, which was a description that applied to a number of things she'd encountered. The curtain moved again. Dr. Reyes leaned in. He looked at her monitors, looked at her face, and came to stand beside the gurney with his arms loosely crossed, the posture of a doctor who has something to say that he's choosing to deliver standing rather than sitting. Your numbers are moving in the right direction, he said. Slowly, but they're moving. I know. I want to keep you on MAG for at least 6 hours and reevaluate. If the BP doesn't come down enough, or if you develop any additional symptoms, then we deliver. Yes. She's 33 weeks and 4 days. I know. NICU is prepped. Dr. Fontaine is on tonight. She's excellent. I've already talked to her. He paused. You've been on your feet for 11 hours. I know that too. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Is there someone we should call? For you? Emily thought about it. Her parents were in Phoenix. Her ex-husband was in Denver, and that was a call she wasn't ready to make and wasn't sure she needed to. She had colleagues, friends, by proximity, people who would come if she asked. Not yet, she said. Let me see how the next few hours go. He nodded and left. The monitor beeped. The drip ran. She thought about Operation Iron Ridge for the first time in a long time without immediately putting it away again. Outside the bay, the corridor had rearranged itself in the way that corridors rearrange when authority arrives. Reeves's 2 colleagues had positioned themselves without making a show of it, one near the main corridor junction, one closer to the ambulance bay, in the manner of people who secure a perimeter without calling it that. The ER staff moved around them with varying degrees of comfort. Abby gave them a wide berth. Dr. Hargrove looked at them the way she looked at a complication she had decided to manage rather than fight. Douglas Pratt was in the administrative alcove with his phone pressed to his ear and the expression of a man who had recently realized that the situation he had mismanaged was significantly larger than he had originally estimated. He was talking to someone on the hospital's legal team. The words filtered out in pieces, liability and protocol, and well within standard practice, the architecture of a defense being hastily constructed. In the waiting area, Nolan Marsh had been seen by a second physician, a younger doctor named Alvarez, who'd taken one look at the AC joint, confirmed the separation, and begun arranging a sling and a referral. While Alvarez worked, Nolan sat with Rex's leash wrapped twice around his hand, the dog pressed against his left leg, and he watched the corridor with the patient attention of a man with nowhere else to be and several reasons to stay. He'd seen the federal ID when Reeves had presented it at the desk. He'd seen the manner of her colleagues. He had done the math with the particular facility of someone who had, for a decade, operated in environments where incomplete information was the standard and the conclusion arrived at fastest by inference usually turned out to be correct. He wasn't certain, but he was close enough. Rex was calm now, not the brittle, urgent calm of the alert, but the settled calm of a dog who has done what he set out to do and is now waiting to see what happens next. His breathing was slow. His eyes were half closed. He was old and his joints hurt, and he had, against all reasonable expectation, walked into a civilian emergency department at the end of a routine. Thursday, and found something he recognized and responded to it the way he had been trained 4 years ago and 1,000 miles from here. Alvarez finished with the sling. You'll want to follow up with ortho in the next week. The separation isn't severe, but you need to be careful about... Yeah. Nolan flexed the fingers of his right hand experimentally. I've had it before. I know, you mentioned. Alvarez capped his pen. The dog. He okay? He's fine. He's tired. He did something earlier. One of the nurses was telling me. Alvarez looked at Rex. Medical alert? Something like that. That's... Alvarez stopped. Is the nurse okay? The one he... I don't know yet, Nolan said. Alvarez nodded slowly and left. Nolan leaned back in the plastic chair and looked at the corridor and waited. The next development arrived not from the corridor, but from outside. The automatic doors slid open and a man walked in who was not seeking medical attention. He was in his early 60s, barrel-chested, with a military bearing so deeply embedded that it had ceased to be bearing and simply become posture, the permanent physiological record of decades of a certain kind of life. He wore civilian clothes, khakis and a dark jacket, but his eyes moved through the room the way eyes move when they've spent years being professionally responsible for what they find. He went straight to the reception desk, produced identification, spoke quietly. The receptionist reached for the phone for the third time that evening. Rex's head came up from Nolan's knee, not with the alert of before, with something different, something Nolan had seen exactly twice before in 12 years working with the dog, on two specific occasions that had preceded two specific events that he still thought about at 3 in the morning sometimes. Rex stood up. He was looking at the man at the reception desk. His tail moved, once, twice, with the cautious, uncertain motion of recognition trying to confirm itself against the passage of time. The man turned from the desk, and his eyes swept the room and landed on Rex. He stopped moving entirely. For a long moment, 3 seconds, 4, neither of them moved. The man and the dog, separated by 15 feet of waiting room, looking at each other with the shared history that existed between a working animal and the humans who'd worked alongside it. Then the man walked across the room. He crouched down in front of Rex in the specific way that people who know working dogs crouch, low, unthreatening, hands visible. And Rex, 12-year-old, silver-muzzled, arthritic Rex, pushed his nose into the man's palm. "Hey, partner," the man said. His voice was rough. "Been a while." Nolan looked at the man. "You know him." It wasn't quite a question. The man looked up. "Sergeant First Class Doyle, retired." He didn't extend the hand for shaking. Both were on Rex. "He was assigned to my unit for 11 months, 2018 to 2019. He paused. "Then he transferred to a different team, and I figured I'd never see him again." "He transferred to someone specific?" Doyle looked at Nolan and then at the corridor. "Someone who knew how to work with him." He stood. "Is she here? In this hospital?" "Who?" Doyle looked at him with the patience of someone who has decided not to waste time being indirect. "The medic. Voss. Emily Voss. Or whatever name she's going by now." Nolan was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "She's in Bay 1. She's sick. She's being treated." Doyle's face went through something that he managed quickly. "How sick?" "Blood pressure emergency. She's pregnant." Nolan paused. "She's being monitored. The OB is with her." "But she was talking when they took her in. She was coherent. She was telling them exactly what she needed." He paused. "She knows what's wrong with her." Something in Doyle settled, not fully, but enough. He sat down in the chair beside Nolan, and Rex moved between them with the easy familiarity of a dog who had belonged, at different points, to both their worlds. "How long have you been here?" "About 2 hours." "You were the one who brought her in?" "She was already here. She works here." Nolan looked at him. "Rex found her. I didn't know who she was." Doyle looked at the dog. He would. He rubbed Rex's ear, the good one. He always had a particular thing about her. She trained him for the medical alerts. Not officially. It wasn't in the protocol. She just did it on her own time because she said the dogs were capable of more than we were using them for. She trained him. Spent about 6 months working with him. After that, he'd alert on 3 different cardiac conditions, 2 respiratory presentations, and hypoglycemia. None of it was documented because it wasn't a sanctioned program. He paused. "She wasn't supposed to be doing it. She did it anyway. That was—" He stopped. "That was Emily." Nolan said nothing. Rex's tail moved slowly. Down the corridor, the curtain to Bay 1 moved, and Dr. Reyes stepped out and immediately went to Hargrove, who was at the nurse's station. They spoke quietly. Hargrove looked at a tablet. Reyes said something. Hargrove nodded, once, the nod of someone accepting information they were prepared for but didn't want. Nolan watched them. "What happened in Iron Ridge?" he said. Doyle was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Rex instead of Nolan. "You have clearance?" "I had clearance. I've been out 3 years." "Then you know I can't—" "I'm not asking for classified specifics. I'm asking what happened to her." Doyle exhaled. "She made a call that wasn't hers to make, officially, in the field. There was an evacuation, and there were civilians. A village, about 40 people, mostly women and kids. And the original extraction plan did not account for them. The call from command was to proceed with extraction and let the local forces handle the civilian situation." He stopped. "She didn't proceed with that call. She stayed. She rerouted resources, which meant the extraction took 40 minutes longer than planned, which meant the team was exposed longer, which meant he stopped again. 2 soldiers were wounded during the extended window, not critically, but enough. There were complaints filed, a review. He paused. The original recommendation was a formal reprimand and removal from forward deployment. But the civilians who were evacuated included 11 children, and the 40 minutes she added to the extraction timeline was the exact window in which an airstrike hit the original coordinates where those civilians had been. He said it simply, without drama, because the kind of people who had spent time in those environments had usually metabolized the drama out of their most significant memories, and what was left was just the fact. If she'd followed the original call, they'd have been there. Nolan looked at the corridor, and she took the reprimand. She resigned before the process completed, didn't contest it, didn't explain herself publicly, just disappeared. We heard she became a nurse. Doyle looked at Rex. Rex was reassigned after she left. He was never quite the same. He paused. I don't mean that as a metaphor. He literally started refusing deployment conditions he'd previously been fine with. It took us 6 months to figure out it was because she was gone. Nolan sat with that for a moment. Rex's breathing was slow and even between them. The corridor moved. Abby came out of Bay 1 with a chart and went to the nurses' station with the quick step of someone managing an evolving situation. Hargrove looked at the chart. Reyes was on the phone now, standing near the window, and his voice had the controlled urgency that signified that whatever they'd hoped to manage conservatively had shifted register. Then the monitor alarm went off. Not the brief single tone from before. This was sustained, 2 quick beeps, then the sustained tone that meant a threshold had been crossed, and it was coming from Bay 1, and Hargrove moved fast, and Reyes ended his call mid-sentence and moved faster, and 2 nurses converged on the bay in the way that emergency staff converge when something has changed. The curtain swept shut. From the waiting room, Nolan was on his feet. So was Doyle. Rex stood between them, head up, ears forward, the silver-muzzled face oriented toward Bay 1 with absolute and unwavering attention. Reeves appeared from the side corridor, already moving toward the bay, already intercepted by Hargrove, who turned from the doorway and held up one hand. Back, Hargrove said. Everyone back. What happened? I said back. Hargrove's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Let us work. Reeves stopped. She turned and found Doyle's eyes across the waiting room. Something passed between them that Nolan couldn't fully read. Not panic, not helplessness, but the specific anguish of people who were accustomed to being able to act, and had just arrived at a situation in which action wasn't theirs to take. Behind the curtain, voices. Dr. Reyes, measured but accelerated. Another voice Nolan didn't recognize, efficient and direct. Abby's voice once, then not again. The sound of equipment, the sound of motion that had purpose in it. The monitor tone continued for 7 seconds and then changed. Different pattern, still alarmed, but different. Rex sat down. He sat down directly in the center of the waiting room floor, between the chairs and the corridor, and he bowed his head, and he was absolutely still. Doyle looked at the dog. His jaw was tight. He does that when he's waiting for something he can't help with, he said quietly. Nolan said nothing. 3 minutes passed. Then 5. The ER continued around the situation. A child came through triage with a broken wrist. A paramedic came in with a handoff. Phones rang. Normal, relentless, indifferent to whatever was happening in Bay 1. At minute 6, Hargrove came out of the bay. She went directly to the phone at the nurse's station. She dialed 3 numbers and spoke briefly, and what she said made the nurse at the station stand up from her chair. Or 2, Hargrove said. Now. Tell them it's an emergency cesarean, maternal BP uncontrolled at 178/120, clinical seizure activity, 33 weeks and 4 days. I need a full team in 20 minutes. She hung up, turned, found Reeves standing 6 feet away. She's being taken to surgery, Hargrove said. Eclamptic episode. We caught it early. She's still conscious. She was talking to us 30 seconds ago. We're managing it, but we're delivering the baby tonight. She paused, and something in her face was both professional and entirely human. She was asking about the baby. That was the last thing she said before we moved her. Is the NICU team ready? Hargrove stopped. You want to know what kind of person she is? That's who she is. Reeves didn't answer. She turned away and stood facing the wall for a moment, and the back of her neck was tight. Doyle had come to the edge of the waiting area. "She'll be okay?" "I'm not making promises I can't keep," Hargrove said, with the brutal honesty of a physician who had stopped doing that a long time ago. "But yes, I believe she'll be okay. We know what we're dealing with. We caught it before it became irreversible. The team is good." She looked at Doyle, then at the dog sitting silent in the middle of the floor. Whatever that animal did tonight, whatever prompted the blood pressure check, it saved her life. And the babies. I want that on record. She moved away, already 2 steps into the next thing, because that was what emergency medicine was. Always the next thing, before the last thing was fully resolved. Nolan sat back down. Rex came to him without being called and put his head on Nolan's knee again, and Nolan's hand came down on the dog's back, automatic. Doyle sat beside them. He had his phone in his hand and he was composing a message to someone. Nolan could see the prefix, military formatting, compact and specific. "Who are you messaging?" Nolan said. "The review board coordinator." Doyle didn't look up. "And 2 men from the unit who've been waiting for information about her for 8 months. He paused. "And one of the families." He stopped typing. "One of the children who made it out of that valley is 12 years old now. His mother writes to the oversight committee every 4 months asking what happened to the woman who carried him." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't know. Emily never filed a report on what she did, never gave a statement. The only records are witness accounts from the soldiers in the unit and the classified field logs, which nobody could access until 6 weeks ago." Doyle put his phone in his pocket. "She saved those people and then left and never said a word about it." Above them, the overhead fluorescents hummed. The ER moved around them. Somewhere in the building, in a room with different lights and different sounds, a surgical team was doing what surgical teams do. Deliberate, technical, human, imperfect, and often enough. Rex's breathing was slow and deep. The old dog was tired. His ear, the crooked one, twitched twice. Then the main doors slid open again. And this time it was not 1 person or 3. It was a group. 4 individuals who came through the doors in a loose formation, and even before the doors had fully closed, the ER waiting room felt different. Not louder. Different the way a room feels different when the center of gravity shifts, when the thing that has been building quietly in the background finally arrives in the foreground and demands to be named. The person in front was a man in a dark uniform. Not hospital, not local law enforcement. He had the rank insignia of a lieutenant colonel, and he moved with the particular certainty of someone who had not needed to raise his voice in approximately 15 years because he had figured out that not raising it was more effective. Beside him, a woman in civilian clothes carried a document case. Behind them, 2 others. They went to the reception desk. The lieutenant colonel produced credentials. The receptionist looked at them and looked at the 4 people and made a decision that was visible in her face. She reached for the phone without being asked. Doyle was on his feet. Nolan looked at him. "That's Colonel Haas," Doyle said quietly. He commanded the operation. Rex raised his head from Nolan's knee. He looked at Haas across the waiting room and made a sound, very low, a single note, not aggressive, more like a question. Haas heard it. His eyes moved across the room and found the dog, and found Doyle, and his expression shifted into something that had more information in it than Nolan could quickly read. Recognition, and something more complicated, and something else underneath that, the kind of thing that accumulates in people who carry a decision they got wrong for long enough. He walked across the room. "Sergeant First Class Doyle." He extended his hand. "Sir?" Doyle shook it. A pause. "She's in surgery." Haas absorbed that. He looked at Rex. He crouched down, the same way Doyle had, low, hands out, and Rex allowed him to place both hands on his head, and the dog was still and grave under them, 12 years of service contained in a silver muzzle and a crooked ear. "We got here as fast as we could," Haas said. He wasn't talking to Doyle anymore. He wasn't talking to Nolan. He might have been talking to the dog, or to himself. "There were classified material transfers and an oversight committee meeting and 17 different signatures required before I could walk out the door." He stood. He looked at the corridor that led to the surgical suites. "I owe her more than I can say in a hallway," he said, "but I'm going to start anyway." "She's in surgery, sir," Doyle said again. "I know." He turned. He looked at his colleague with the document case. Set up here. We're not leaving. The woman nodded and began clearing space on a waiting room table, opening the case, and what came out of it was not paperwork in the administrative sense. These were official documents, and even from where Nolan sat he could see stamps and signatures and the formatting of military records, and he had been in that world long enough to know what documentation that arrived under those circumstances in that quantity usually meant. Somewhere above them, through ceiling and floor and the institution of the hospital itself, there was a woman on an operating table who did not know they were here, who had spent 4 years being ordinary in a place that did not know what she was, who had clocked out of shifts and charted medications, and remembered which patients were afraid of needles, and had carried what she'd done alone, without testimony, without record, without a single person in her current life who knew. Rex put his head down on his paws. Nolan watched Colonel Haas take a seat across the room, upright in the plastic chair with the document case open on the table in front of him, and he thought about the kind of person who saves 11 children and then goes home and says nothing, and he didn't have a word for it, and he thought maybe that was the point, that the things that mattered most were often the things that had no satisfying name. The surgical suite light above the corridor was on. Red. Nobody moved. The red light stayed on for 41 minutes. Nolan knew because he watched the clock on the wall above the reception desk without meaning to, the way you watch things when you have nothing useful to do and your body is still trying to find an action to take. The second hand moved, the waiting room breathed around him. Colonel Haas sat across from him with his hands folded on the document case and his eyes on the corridor, and nobody said anything that wasn't necessary. Doyle got coffee from the machine near the entrance, brought one back for Nolan without asking, set one on the table near Haas, who acknowledged it with a single nod and didn't drink it. Reeves stood near the corridor entrance with her phone in her hand, reading something or pretending to. Rex slept. Actual sleep. Not the vigilant half-rest of a dog on duty, but the deep, slow-breathing sleep of an animal who has done the thing he set out to do and has nothing left to manage. His legs twitched once, briefly. Nolan watched the rise and fall of his ribs and thought about what Doyle had told him, and thought about a woman spending 6 months on her own time teaching a dog to recognize what medicine missed, and then leaving and never mentioning it. At minute 42, the red light went off. Nobody moved for 2 seconds. Then Haas stood. Then Reeves looked up from her phone. Then Doyle set down the coffee and turned. Dr. Fontaine came through the surgical suite doors. She was small and unhurried in the specific way of surgeons who had learned that hurrying after the fact served no one. She had already removed her surgical cap, and her hair was flattened on one side. She looked at the waiting area, found Hargrove, and walked to her first. Nolan couldn't hear what she said, but he watched Hargrove's shoulders drop half an inch, and he interpreted that correctly. Hargrove turned and came to the waiting area. She looked at Haas, then at Doyle, then at Reeves, apparently deciding that all of them were going to receive this information simultaneously, and that was fine. "She's out of surgery," Hargrove said. "Both of them." Doyle let out a breath that had clearly been held for longer than he'd realized. The eclamptic episode was controlled before it caused significant neurological impact. Her BP came down during surgery. She lost more blood than we'd like, but she's being transfused and her numbers are moving in the right direction. Hargrove paused. "The baby..." She stopped. Not because she was composing herself, but because the next sentence required more precision than the previous ones, and she was taking the time to give it. "The baby was delivered at 33 weeks and 4 days. She's small. Her lungs need support. She's in the NICU." Dr. Fontaine assessed her as a 2 on the respiratory support scale, which is not ideal, but is also not the worst we see at this gestational age. Another pause. "She's alive. She's fighting. That's what I can tell you right now." Haas was looking at the floor. When he looked up, his face was controlled in the practiced way of someone who had delivered and received difficult news in professional settings for decades. "Emily, will she be able to..." "She was asking about the baby before the anesthesia took hold," Hargrove said. "She'll want to see her as soon as she's stable enough to move." She looked at Haas. "She doesn't know you're here. She doesn't know any of you are here." Haas was quiet for a moment. "When she's recovered enough to receive visitors..." "I'll let you know when that is," Hargrove said, with the tone of someone who was not ceding that decision. "On my timeline, not yours." Haas looked at her. He nodded once. "Understood." Hargrove went back to the nurse's station. The waiting room absorbed the information and rearranged itself around it. Reeves sat down, which she hadn't done since she'd arrived. Doyle went back to his coffee. Haas opened the document case and looked at its contents for a long moment before closing it again. Nolan sat beside Rex and watched the corridor. He thought about the shoulder that had brought him here. The dull ache of it was still there, wrapped in the sling, a familiar old problem that had provided the specific occasion for being in this room at this time, which he was already understanding was not an accident in any meaningful sense, even though it was an accident in every literal one. He thought about Rex stopping in the middle of a hospital waiting room and sitting down in front of a stranger and making a sound that contained medical information. He thought about how many times the dog had been right, in other places, and about other things, and how the rightness had never been mystical, and had always turned out to have a very specific and very practical explanation. Rex had learned from her. He had spent 6 months learning a language from her, and then she had left, and the language had stayed. Douglas Pratt reappeared from the administrative wing at approximately 9:40. He had the look of someone who had spent the last 2 hours in phone calls and was now evaluating the landscape before deciding on his next action. He stood at the edge of the ER main room and looked at the waiting area. At Haas, at the document case, at Reeves and her federal ID, at Doyle. And the evaluation lasted about 3 seconds before he turned and went back the way he'd come. He did not go far. In the administrative corridor, he was on the phone again within 90 seconds, and this time his voice was different, lower, faster. The voice of someone who had decided that the situation required an external solution because the internal one had closed off. Reeves, standing near the corridor entrance, heard enough of it to turn and look at her colleague, the one positioned near the junction. A look passed between them. Her colleague moved quietly toward the administrative corridor. Nolan watched this happen without appearing to watch. The peripheral habits of years were hard to break, and he didn't try to break them. At 10:15, Dr. Hargrove came to the waiting area and said that Emily was in recovery and conscious, that her blood pressure was 142/94, still elevated but moving, that she was asking about the baby and asking about her charts, and asking if someone had updated her active patients. She wanted to know about a man in Bay 4 with an elevated troponin, Hargrove said, with a look that suggested she found this simultaneously exasperating and exactly right, and that visitors would be allowed in pairs briefly once she was moved to a step-down room. She doesn't know about, Doyle gestured toward Haas. I told her she had visitors, Hargrove said. She asked if it was a colleague. I said it was more than that. She said, Hargrove stopped briefly. She said, how many? I said at least 4. She said, is it about Iron Ridge? I said I didn't know. She said, okay, and asked me again about the troponin. Doyle almost smiled. That's Emily. Hargrove looked at the group. The baby's name. She told the NICU nurse before surgery, in case she couldn't. She wanted someone to know. She paused. Clara. The room absorbed that. Huss looked at the document case. He opened it. He set the top document on his knee and looked at it with the expression of someone reviewing something they have read enough times to know by heart, but still feel the weight of. At 10:58, a nurse came and told them that Emily Voss was in room 214 and was asking to see someone. Haas stood. Doyle stood. Reeves looked at her colleagues and made a decision. You first, she said to Haas. It should be you first. He looked at her for a moment, and there was enough in his face that Nolan had to look away, because some things were private even when they happened in public. Doyle, Haas said. Sir. Come with me. They went. Nolan stayed in the waiting area with Rex, who was awake now, and with Reeves, who had sat back down. The ER ran its night operation around them, the small hours beginning to bring different traffic, different presentations, the specific exhaustion of a department that never fully stopped. You didn't know her, Reeves said. It wasn't accusatory, just observational. No. But you stayed. Nolan looked at Rex. He stayed. I stayed with him. Reeves was quiet for a moment. He remembered her. 4 years later, different state, civilian clothes, hospital setting, nothing that should have triggered none of the environmental cues from their original context. He just recognized something. Nolan paused. She trained it into him. Whatever she trained into him, it became part of how he reads the world. Reeves looked at Rex with the expression of someone updating a prior belief. She wrote about it once. in a personal log that we found when we were reviewing her records. She said the dogs were capable of medical detection without formal training if someone took the time to show them what to look for. She'd read the research. She adapted it. She paused. Nobody authorized it. She did it anyway. Yes. Like in the valley. Reeves looked at him. You know about Iron Ridge. Doyle told me enough. She nodded. She has a pattern, she said without judgment. She sees what needs to happen and she does it, and she doesn't wait for permission and she doesn't explain it afterward. Does that bother the committee? Reeves was quiet for a long moment. It did. It doesn't anymore. Not after we read the full accounts. She paused. Not after we counted. Room 214 was on the second floor, at the end of a corridor that smelled like every hospital corridor smelled. Antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that was neither clean nor unclean but simply institutional, the smell of a place built to contain the most extreme versions of ordinary human experience. Haas went in first. He almost didn't recognize her immediately, which surprised him, because he had been thinking about her face for 4 years, and had expected the recognition to be immediate. But she was in a hospital bed, smaller than he remembered, with an IV in her left arm and monitors on both sides, and the particular pallor of someone who has lost blood and is being given back what the body cannot replace fast enough on its own. Her hair was loose on the pillow. Her eyes were open. She looked at him for 2 seconds. Colonel Haas, she said. Her voice was rougher than he remembered. The magnesium, the anesthesia, the hours of her body working against itself, all of it was in her voice. But the steadiness was there. It had always been there. Emily. He came to stand at the foot of the bed. He had rehearsed several things to say, in the car on the drive over, in the waiting room, in the elevator. None of them had survived contact with the actual moment, which was also a pattern he recognized from other kinds of operations. How are you feeling? I felt worse, she said, twice. She looked at him and then at Doyle standing in the doorway. Doyle? Hey, Voss. Doyle's voice was rough in a different way. You look old. You look terrible. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. It cost her something, and she stopped after one beat of it. Is Clara okay? The NICU nurse said she was okay, but I want... She's okay, Haas said. Dr. Fontaine confirmed it on the way up. Respiratory support, but stable. They say she's strong. Emily closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were the eyes of someone who had been braced for a different answer and was now recalibrating for the actual one, which was the best one. And the recalibration took a moment because the relief was physical, and she was already managing a body that had been through considerable difficulty. Okay, she said. Okay. She looked at the ceiling, then at Haas. Why are you here? And don't give me the official version first. Give me the real one. Haas pulled a chair to the bedside and sat. Doyle moved into the room and leaned against the wall, arms folded, the way he'd stood in 100 briefings. The classification was partially lifted, Haas said. There's a review board, a formal one, with oversight committee involvement. They've been reviewing Iron Ridge for 8 weeks. I know about the review, she said. Agent Reeves told me. There are accounts on record now. 7 of the soldiers from the unit gave formal statements. The field logs have been partially declassified. He paused. Emily. The review board's preliminary finding was released last week. She waited. They found that the decision made in the field during the Iron Ridge evacuation constituted a deviation from protocol, but not a violation of lawful orders. The distinction matters legally. He stopped. They also found that the deviation directly resulted in the preservation of 41 civilian lives, 11 of whom were children, and that the tactical risk incurred by the extension of the extraction timeline was within acceptable parameters given the available intelligence at the time. She was looking at him with the flat attention of someone receiving information they're going to need to think about for a long time, but can't afford to think about right now. There's more, he said. I figured. The recommendation from the review board, formally, with the signatures of all 7 members, is that the reprimand on your record be struck and replaced with a commendation. He reached into the document case, which he'd carried up from the waiting room, and produced a single document. He set it on the bedside table. I didn't sign the reprimand willingly. I want you to know that. I argued against it for as long as I could. I know you did, she said. I also know the pressure you were under. I never blamed you for it. You should have. That's not how I'm built. She looked at the document on the table without picking it up. A commendation. And a formal apology from the Army, which I've been authorized to deliver in person. He paused. I know that's insufficient. I've known it for 4 years. But it's what I have that I can give you right now, in this room, and I'm giving it to you. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hand moved, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone working around an IV line, and she picked up the document. She looked at it. She read the first paragraph. She set it back down. What happened to Sergeant Lyle? She said. He was one of the ones who filed the initial complaint. Haas was quiet. He's been out for 2 years. Is he okay? Haas looked at her. He's fine. He wrote one of the 7 statements to the review board. In your favor. Good. She settled back against the pillow. I don't need the commendation to mean something. It can just be a document. She paused. But the record. If the reprimand is struck, it's already in process, Haas said. The paperwork is with the formal records office. It'll take 4 to 6 weeks to finalize, but the board's decision is binding. She exhaled. Long and controlled, the breath of someone releasing something they had been carrying for long enough that the release was more complicated than the carrying. Okay, she said. Then, after a pause, there's a man downstairs named Nolan Marsh. He came in with a hurt shoulder. He's the one who Rex alerted on me, and Nolan was the one who pushed. We know, Haas said. We ran him. He's not part of this. I know, but he's staying. He said so when we came up. She was quiet for a moment. And Rex is here, in the hospital. Sleeping in the waiting room, Doyle said. He looks about 100 years old. He's 12. That's old for a Malinois. She was quiet. He remembered. He remembered, Doyle confirmed. She looked at the ceiling again. Something moved across her face. Not a single emotion, but several of them, layered, the way feelings are, when the thing that's happening has been waited for long enough that the waiting has become part of the feeling. Doyle, she said. Yeah. He needs a better bed. He's been sleeping on hard floors for 12 years. I'll get him a bed, Doyle said, and his voice was steady, but not fully. Haas stood. He had more in the document case. He had not shown her everything, the full scope of what was being arranged, and the 17 families and the letter from the 12-year-old boy's mother, but he had also been in enough rooms with enough people to know when a person had received the maximum they could absorb in one sitting. We'll be here, he said. Take your time. When you're ready for the rest of it. Tomorrow, she said. Come back tomorrow. She paused. My daughter. When can I? I'll talk to Hargrove, Haas said. Tonight, if your numbers cooperate. Make it happen, she said. Not as a request. Haas almost smiled. Yes, Staff Sergeant. They left. The door closed part way. Emily lay in the partial dark of a hospital room at 11 o'clock at night, the monitors beside her running their quiet commentary on the state of her body, the document on the bedside table, the IV in her arm. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about 4 years of being ordinary, 4 years of charting medications and remembering patients' names and calibrating her blood pressure checks and staying after shift and not explaining herself to anyone. 4 years of carrying a decision that she would make again, without hesitation, and had never had cause to regret except in the administrative sense, which was the least important sense. She thought about a dog sitting down in front of her in an emergency room and refusing to move. She thought about Clara in an incubator somewhere above her, with lungs that were small and new and working harder than they should have to. She thought, tomorrow for the rest of it. She slept. In the morning, the hospital was different. Not louder. It was always loud, in the particular distributed way of large institutions that never fully stop. But the character of it had changed. The night shift had handed to the day shift with the usual overlapping chaos, and now it was 8 o'clock, and the light through the windows was real instead of fluorescent, and the ER below had a different population, and Douglas Pratt had not come in for his usual 7:30 arrival. His absence was noted. It was noted because Pratt was the kind of supervisor whose presence was mostly organizational, but whose absence created a specific kind of administrative vacuum, and filling that vacuum required someone to make phone calls. And when the phone calls were made, the person who answered them was not Pratt, but a woman named Karen Solis from the hospital's compliance office, who had a voice like a document being very carefully folded. She told the charge nurse that there was an ongoing internal review and that she would be in at 9 to answer questions, and that all administrative decisions for the department were temporarily routed through the director of operations. The charge nurse, a steady woman named Patricia, who had been working the ER for 11 years and had seen most kinds of administrative weather, relayed this information to the floor staff with exactly the neutrality the situation required, and then went back to managing the board. At 8:20, Dr. Hargrove stopped by room 214. Emily was awake. She'd been awake since 6, which was earlier than the nurses wanted, but not unexpected given who she was, and she had already had a cup of terrible hospital coffee and had reviewed what she could reach of her own chart from her tablet, which Abby had somewhat reluctantly handed over after Emily had asked for it twice. "Your morning BP was 138/90, Hargrove said, sitting in the chair that Haas had occupied the night before. "Still elevated, still on mag. We'll wean you this afternoon if you hold. I'll hold." Famous last words of nurses everywhere. Hargrove looked at her. "You look better." "I feel like I've been rearranged." "You have been, technically." Hargrove paused. "Clara's morning update. Her respiratory numbers improved overnight. They've reduced support slightly. Dr. Fontaine thinks she's trending in the right direction." Emily put down the tablet. "When can I go to her?" "We're planning a transport to the NICU floor at 10, assuming your BP continues." "Wheelchair. You're not walking it." "I know." "You're also not arguing about the wheelchair." "I know that too." Hargrove looked at her for a moment. "The people downstairs, the colonel, the federal agent. They told me." "I figured." Hargrove folded her hands. "There's something else. Not from them." She paused. "The hospital board is convening an emergency session this morning. The compliance office initiated it. There are—" She stopped. "There are questions about what happened yesterday, about the decision to send you home during active duty." Emily was quiet. "You were experiencing symptoms consistent with a medical emergency for several hours before anyone checked your blood pressure," Hargrove said. "That's the finding. Preliminary, but it's going to be a formal one." She paused. "Douglas was instructed to send you home. He chose to do it the way he did. There's security footage, there are witness accounts." "I'm not filing anything," Emily said. "You may not need to." Hargrove looked at her. "The board may act on its own initiative. That's between them and their legal team." She paused. "I'm telling you because you should know before you see it in an email." Emily looked at the window. The morning light was coming in at a low angle and making a rectangle on the floor, and she watched it for a moment. "How's Bay 4?" she said. "The man with the elevated troponin." Hargrove blinked. Then she laughed, a short, genuine one. "He had a cardiac cath this morning. Mild LAD stenosis. Manageable." She shook her head. "You're unbelievable." "He was presenting atypically. I was worried." "He's fine." Hargrove stood. 10 o'clock for the NICU transport. Try to eat something before then." She left. Emily looked at the ceiling. She looked at the document from Haas on the bedside table, which she'd read in full at 6:15 that morning in the bad light of the bedside lamp, reading the formal language of the review board's findings, with the detached attention of someone who understood bureaucratic documents and had learned not to assign them too much emotional weight too quickly. The weight would settle in its own time. The weight was already settling. She could feel it, not as triumph, not as vindication in the dramatic sense, but as a slow release of something structural, something that had been load-bearing for 4 years and was now being redistributed. At 9:15, Nolan knocked on the door. "I was still in the clothes from the previous night, slightly rumpled, the canvas jacket over the sling." He stood in the doorway with the hesitance of someone who is not sure they've been invited and knows they can't fully claim that they have. "Hargrove said you were awake," he said. "Come in." He came in. He took the chair without being offered it, which she noted, and sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at her with direct attention, the look of someone who is going to tell you the truth, regardless of how it lands. "You look less terrible than I expected," he said. "That's a low bar." "It's an honest one." She looked at him. "Where's Rex?" "Doyle took him for a walk. He needs the yard more than the hospital right now." He paused. "He's okay. Tired. Happy, I think. In the way that old dogs are happy when they've done something. He remembered me. Doyle explained why. The training. She was quiet. I didn't know if any of it stuck. I left before I could verify. She looked at her hands. I should have verified. He verified for you, Nolan said. Last night. She looked at him. He was the kind of man who didn't dress up what he was saying and didn't need to, and she found she didn't have the energy for anything that required more interpretation than it gave, so she was grateful for that. You pushed Pratt to take the blood pressure, she said. You were the one who pushed. Rex pushed. You pushed, she said again. I noticed. I noticed even then, while I was arguing with him. You would have noticed it yourself, in another 20 minutes maybe. Maybe, she paused. Or maybe not. That's the thing about being on the wrong side of the gurney. You stop doing the math on yourself. She looked at the window. So thank you. He nodded. Simple. No performance around it. The Colonel, she said. What did he say to you last night? Not much. Doyle talked more. He paused. He told me about the valley. She didn't respond immediately. How much? Enough. She was quiet for a long moment. The monitor beside her ran its commentary. Outside the window, the morning continued its ordinary business. I don't need people to think I'm a hero, she said finally. I need Clara to breathe well enough that they take her off support before I'm discharged. That's the only thing I need right now. I know, he said. The rest of it... She gestured vaguely at the document on the table, at the wall that stood between her and the waiting room where the whole apparatus of official recognition had settled in overnight. I'll figure out what to do with it. Yeah, he said. He stood. Doyle will be back with Rex at 10. I told him about the NICU transport. He wants to be here when you come back. She looked at him. Why? He picked up his jacket. I think he just wants to see your face when you see her. He moved toward the door, stopped. The dog's going to be fine. He's eaten twice this morning, and the only thing wrong with him is that he's tired and old and his joints hurt and he needs a better bed, which apparently Doyle is handling. She almost smiled. I told Doyle that. He told me you told him that at 11 o'clock at night from a hospital bed, which is... He shook his head. Something. He left. She lay in the half-morning, one hand on the railing of the bed, her other arm with the IV, listening to the hospital around her. At some distance, through walls and floors and the institution, Clara was in an incubator with lungs that were working harder than they should. Emily focused on that. She focused on 10 o'clock and the wheelchair and what it would feel like to see her daughter for the first time, which she had been preparing for and which no amount of preparation would be sufficient for. At 9:52, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, Colorado area code. She answered it. Emily Voss? Yes. A pause. A voice. A woman, older, accent she couldn't immediately place. My name is Amara Osei. I'm calling from the Oversight Committee office. Another pause. I was given your number this morning. I hope that's appropriate. Go ahead. I'm the coordinator for the Iron Ridge Review Board. The woman's voice was careful in the way of someone delivering something they've thought about for a long time. I'm calling because there's something I was asked to relay to you directly before the formal proceedings tomorrow. From someone who... She stopped. He asked me to read it directly. May I? Emily looked at the ceiling. Go ahead. The woman read, My name is Kwame. I am 12 years old. My mother says the woman who carried me out of the valley 4 years ago was named Emily. She says I was too small to remember, but I was there. I have been told you are being given a commendation. I wanted to tell you before that happens that I already know what you did, and I don't need anyone to tell me that it was important. My mother lights a candle for you every year. I don't know how to explain why I'm writing this. I just didn't want you to receive an official letter without also receiving a letter that wasn't official. I hope you and your baby are okay. Silence. Emily said nothing for a long moment. The monitor beside her ran its quiet commentary. The rectangle of light on the floor had moved 3 inches since she'd started watching it. Thank you, she said finally. He asked if you would write back, the coordinator said. When you're ready. No urgency. Just when you're ready. Yes, Emily said. Tell him yes. She ended the call. She put the phone face down on the blanket and looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly, the way she'd learned to breathe in situations where breathing was the only thing she could fully control. And this time the slowness of it was not management, it was something else, something that did not have a clean name and didn't need one. At 9:58, her door opened. Not Nolan, not Hargrove, not Abby or Doyle or anyone she'd expected. It was a woman she recognized from the hospital administration wing. Not Karen Solis, someone else, younger, with the specific deer in headlights effect of a person who has been sent to deliver news that they did not choose and do not fully understand. "Ms. Voss," the woman said, "I'm sorry to disturb you. My name is Jess Hartley. I'm with the hospital board office. I was asked to, She stopped, steadied. "Mr. Pratt will not be in the building today. Pending the outcome of the compliance review, he has been placed on administrative leave." Emily looked at her. "The board is also aware of 2 other senior staff members in the emergency department who were on duty yesterday evening. They've been placed on administrative leave pending the review." She paused. "I was asked to inform you personally and to let you know that the board will be issuing a formal statement this afternoon." Emily looked at the woman, really looked at her, the way she looked at patients who were telling her something while visibly carrying something else. "How long have you worked here?" The woman blinked. 3 years. "Is this the first time you've been sent to deliver news like this?" "Yes." "Okay." Emily let her off the hook. "Thank you for coming in person. You can go." The woman left with something like relief. Emily looked at the ceiling again. She picked up her phone. She looked at the time, 9:59. 60 seconds until Hargrove would arrive with the wheelchair. She put the phone down. She looked at the document. She looked at the window. She thought, Pratt, on administrative leave, a board in emergency session, Karen Solis from compliance with her carefully folded voice, the whole institutional architecture beginning to correct for what it had done, slowly and with significant friction, the way institutions always corrected, not because they were sorry, but because the evidence had become undeniable and the exposure had become untenable. And below her, in the waiting room, a man with a sling and an old dog and a retired soldier and a federal agent and a colonel with a document case, all in the blue plastic chairs, waiting. She heard the wheelchair in the corridor before she saw it, and then, quiet at first, almost below the threshold of the hospital's ambient noise, from somewhere above her, through ceiling and floor and the institutional insulation between this room and the one above, a sound she recognized before she processed it, a sound her body knew before her mind caught up. A newborn crying. Clara. It had to be. She was the only one who... She sat up too fast, and the monitor beside her alarmed briefly, and she grabbed the bed rail and steadied, and the monitor reset, and she sat there breathing with her hand on the rail and her heart at a rate that was not acceptable for someone on a magnesium drip. And she didn't care. She did not care at all. The door opened. Hargrove with the wheelchair. She took one look at the monitor, one look at Emily's face, and her expression went through irritation and softened into something else. "That's not her," Hargrove said gently. "The NICU is on the 4th floor. You can't hear it from here." Emily looked at her. Her hand was still on the rail. Her heart was still going at its unacceptable rate. "I know," she said. "You thought..." "I know," she said again. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. She brought the wheelchair to the bedside. She helped Emily transfer into it with the careful efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times, and she was moving toward the door when Emily put her hand on the wheel and stopped. "Hargrove." "What?" "When we get up there..." Emily stopped. She looked at her hands in her lap, the IV still running, the monitors left behind. "I don't want to cry in front of her. She's going to be able to sense it somehow, and I don't want her first experience of me to be me falling apart." Hargrove looked at her. "You just had emergency surgery, an eclamptic episode, and a blood pressure of 178 over 120. You're allowed to fall apart." "Not in front of her." Hargrove said nothing for a moment, then, "I'll have tissues, in case you hold it together just fine." Emily looked up. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. They went out into the corridor. The elevator opened on the 4th floor, and the doors slid apart, and Hargrove wheeled the chair out, and the NICU was 30 feet ahead behind a set of security doors. And standing in front of those doors were Nolan and Doyle and Reeves and Colonel Haas, and two of his colleagues, and all of them turned when the elevator opened, and none of them said a word. Rex was there too. Doyle had him on the leash at his left side. The old dog raised his head when he saw Emily in the chair, and his tail, slow, deliberate, certain, began to move. Emily looked at all of them. She looked at Rex. She looked at the security doors 30 feet ahead. She breathed. She said, "Let's go." And Hargrove began to push the wheelchair forward, and the group around her fell into step without a word, not flanking her dramatically, just there, in the way that people are there when they have no other agenda and nowhere else they're supposed to be. The security doors opened. The NICU nurse inside looked up and saw the wheelchair and the group and did a brief recalibration of the situation before settling on the most important part of it, which was the woman in the chair, and she came forward. "Miss Voss?" "Yes." "She's been awake," the nurse said, "for the last hour. We've been saying she's looking for something." She led them to the incubator in Bay 3, near the window. "I think she was looking for you." Emily gripped the wheel of the chair. Inside the incubator, very small, with tubes and monitors and the particular helpless determination of a body doing the most fundamental work of existing, was Clara. Her eyes were open. They were not focused. A newborn's eyes don't focus, not yet, not for weeks. But they were open, and they were moving, slow and searching, and when the wheelchair came to the side of the incubator and Emily's hand pressed against the access port, and Clara's hand, impossibly small, 8 fingers and 2 thumbs, and everything that was supposed to be there, brushed against Emily's finger. The searching stopped. Behind Emily, in the doorway of Bay 3, Colonel Haas looked at his hands. Doyle looked at the ceiling. Reeves turned 45 degrees away, which was the professional version of what Doyle was doing with the ceiling. Nolan stood with Rex's leash in his right hand and the dog pressed against his leg, and Rex had his head up and his ears forward, and he was watching Emily's back with the expression of an animal who has arrived at the end of a task that was set for him a long time ago in a different place and is only now completing. Emily did not cry. She had said she wouldn't, and she didn't, though it cost her something she would need to replace later, some interior resource she was running low on but not yet out of. She pressed her finger into Clara's hand, and Clara's hand, reflexively, without intention, which was the most honest form of intention, closed around it. Emily leaned forward. She said something, very quietly, too quiet for anyone in the doorway to hear. Then she straightened in the chair and looked at the window and at the morning light coming through it and the city below, the ordinary city of Denton Falls going about its ordinary Thursday business with no knowledge of any of this. That was when Nolan's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. This was not his moment, and he knew it. But the prefix was one he recognized, Military Coordination Office. He stepped into the corridor. "Marsh," he said. A pause. A voice he didn't recognize. "Mr. Marsh, we've been trying to reach Colonel Haas. Is he with you?" "He's occupied right now. What is it?" Another pause. "There's been a development with the review board proceeding. We need the colonel to authorize something before 9 o'clock tomorrow." "What kind of development?" The voice hesitated. "There's a second commendation on the recommendation list. We weren't aware until this morning. It was in the supplementary field records that were declassified 6 weeks ago and only reviewed in full last night." Nolan waited. "There was a training program," the voice said. "Informal, unsanctioned, conducted over approximately 6 months prior to the Iron Ridge deployment. Medical detection conditioning for working dogs." A pause. "The preliminary assessment is that the outcomes of that program, specifically one animal, may have prevented significant casualties during last night's medical emergency." Nolan looked through the window of Bay 3. Emily, in the wheelchair, Clara's hand around her finger, the morning light. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he said. "The board wants to formally recognize the program," the voice said, "which means recognizing the person who designed it." Another pause. "We just need the colonel to sign off." Nolan looked at Haas through the window. Haas was looking at Emily and Clara with the expression of a man who has spent 4 years in the wrong and has just now, not fully, not yet, but the beginning of it, arrived somewhere that might eventually resemble right. "I'll tell him," Nolan said. He ended the call. He stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone in his hand. Rex padded out of Bay 3 and came to stand beside him. The dog looked up at him. His tail moved once. Nolan looked down at him. "She's going to be okay," he said. Not to the dog, not to himself, to something. Rex turned and walked back into the bay. And in the corridor of the NICU on the 4th floor of Harlow Regional Medical Center, on an ordinary Thursday morning in a mid-sized city in Colorado, Douglas Pratt's phone was ringing in an empty office with no one to answer it, and a compliance officer was reviewing 14 months of security footage, and a board was convening, and a review board's second recommendation was waiting for a signature. And none of that was the most important thing happening in the building. The most important thing was a woman in a wheelchair with her finger in her daughter's hand. Everything else would wait. Everything else would wait, but the world outside Bay 3 had no intention of doing so. Harlow Regional's compliance office opened at 8, and by 9:15, it had the particular atmosphere of a room in which several people have simultaneously realized they are on the wrong side of something larger than they initially estimated. Karen Solis had arrived at 8:40 with 2 colleagues from the legal team and a request from the board for every document, every email, every shift log, and every piece of security footage from the emergency department for the preceding 72 hours. This was not an unusual request in the abstract. In the specific context of the previous evening, it was the kind of request that made people who had sent certain emails go very quiet. The security footage was the problem. Not because it was unclear. It was the opposite of unclear. The camera covering the nurse's station and the main ER corridor had captured, in adequate resolution, and with timestamp, the following sequence of events. Emily Voss, visibly pregnant, managing 2 active patient bays through an 11-hour shift. Emily Voss at the nurse's station, exhibiting physical signs that a trained observer would later identify as consistent with hypertensive urgency. Douglas Pratt arriving and speaking with her for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Emily Voss removing her badge and preparing to leave. A service dog refusing to allow her to exit. A blood pressure reading that made the nurse who took it step back from the monitor. Emily Voss being wheeled to Bay 1. All of this was time-stamped and continuous and contained no gaps, because the camera had been running and nobody had thought to consider it a problem until it was. Karen Solis watched the relevant 40 minutes of footage 3 times. She made notes. Her face was the face of someone assembling the architecture of a very significant internal report and finding that the structure was not going to be flattering to the institution. By 10 o'clock, she had requested the personnel files of Douglas Pratt, a charge supervisor named Walt Gibbons, who had been on duty and had said nothing during the corridor exchange, and a third staff member, an administrative coordinator named Teresa Rudd, who had processed the PTO paperwork for Emily's early departure before Emily had even agreed to leave. The paperwork had been time-stamped 4 minutes before the conversation between Pratt and Emily, which meant it had been prepared in advance, which was its own kind of document about intent. Solis looked at that timestamp for a long time. She made a call. The call was to the hospital's external legal counsel. The conversation was brief and specific, and when she ended it, she sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone and then began composing the memorandum that would go to the board at noon. None of this reached Emily directly, not yet. What reached Emily was Clara. Clara at 11 ounces under 2 kilograms, with lungs that were working harder than designed but trending correctly, with the reflexive grip of a hand that had not yet learned to choose anything, but chose everything anyway. Emily sat with her for an hour and 40 minutes before Hargrove made her go back to 214 and rest, which she did without fully sleeping because sleep at this point felt like a concession she couldn't afford. At 1 in the afternoon, Haas came back. He brought the rest of the document case. He sat in the chair and he put the documents on the bedside table, and he said, without preamble, "There are 2 things I need to tell you, and I'm going to tell you both of them, and then I'm going to stop talking." Emily looked at him from the bed. "Okay." The first is that the review board's formal recommendation includes, in addition to the commendation and the record correction, a request that the Army formally acknowledge the medical detection training program you ran with Rex as an unofficial but operationally significant contribution. The assessment is that the program's outcomes, specifically last night, constitute exactly the kind of preventive field medicine the Army has been trying to formalize for a decade. He paused. They want to name it. Emily's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Name what? The protocol. The informal program you designed. They want to take it, formalize it, fund it properly, and implement it across working dog units. He stopped. With your name on it. She was quiet for a long time. Rex did the work. You built him to do it. 6 months of unsanctioned training in my off hours doesn't constitute a program. It does now that it saved 2 lives in a civilian hospital 4 years later. He paused. You can push back on this if you want. You can decline to have your name on it. But I'd like you to at least think about what it would mean for the next medic in the field who has a dog that could be taught to do what Rex does. She looked at the ceiling. She said nothing for a long moment. The second thing. Haas reached into the document case and produced a single sheet that was different from the others. Not military formatting, not official. A printout of an email. He set it on the table. This morning, the review board coordinator received an email from a journalist at the Colorado Tribune, he said. Apparently there's been enough movement at this hospital, board convening, compliance office activity, federal presence in the ER, that someone noticed. The journalist is asking questions. They're not going to get answers from us, but they're going to get them from somewhere else, Emily said. Possibly. She looked at the email printout without picking it up. Is this a warning? It's information. What you do with it is your choice. He paused. My recommendation, and I say this without any institutional interest, purely as someone who made a mistake 4 years ago and has been trying to figure out how to correct for it, is that you decide before the story decides for you. She was quiet. I'm on a magnesium drip. I know. My daughter is on respiratory support in the NICU. I know. You're asking me to think about media strategy. I'm asking you to think about whether you want to control your own narrative or have someone else construct it. He stood. He picked up all the documents from the table except the email printout, which he left. I'll be in the waiting room. Take your time. He left. Emily looked at the email printout. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the window, where the afternoon had shifted, and the light was different from the mornings, and the city below was going about its business the way cities do, without knowledge of or particular interest in what was happening inside any individual building. She picked up her phone. She looked at her contacts for a moment. Then she typed a text to Doyle. Is Nolan still in the building? The response came in 40 seconds. Parking lot with Rex. Want me to get him? She typed, please. She put the phone down. She looked at the email printout again. She was thinking about the 12-year-old boy whose name was Kwame and who had written a letter that was not official and who had said he didn't need anyone to tell him what she'd done was important because he already knew. She was thinking about the fact that there were likely people who had been told by the same institutional machinery that had been trying to manage the story of Iron Ridge for 4 years, a version of events that was either incomplete or incorrect. Not maliciously, necessarily. Institutions managed information the way people managed pain, not always well, often with methods that created new problems. She was thinking about the next nurse, the one who would be 8 months pregnant and visibly symptomatic and sent home by someone who had prepared the paperwork in advance, whether that nurse would have a dog. Nolan knocked and came in without waiting, which she was starting to recognize as his particular rhythm. Haas told you about the journalist, he said. He wasn't asking. He left the email. She handed it to him. He read it quickly. They don't have anything yet, he said. Just questions. They'll have answers. The board is meeting publicly this afternoon. Compliance office reports are technically subject to freedom of information. She paused. My story is going to be out there one way or another. The question is whether it's accurate. He looked at her. What do you want? I don't want to be a story, she said. I want Clara to be breathing unassisted in 3 weeks. I want to go back to work. I want to... She stopped. I want the next pregnant nurse to have someone check her blood pressure. She looked at him. That's what I want. Then say that, he said. When they ask, that's your answer. She looked at him. He was, she thought, a person who had spent enough time in situations where the available options were all bad, that he'd developed the specific economy of someone who had learned to identify the least bad one quickly and commit to it. You're not bad at this, she said. I'm terrible at most things, he said, but yes or no questions I can usually handle. She almost smiled. Okay. Okay, what? I'll talk to them. She picked up the email printout. After Clara's 3 o'clock assessment, not before. He nodded. He moved toward the door, stopped. Rex is in the parking lot. He won't come back inside. She looked up. He's done, Nolan said simply. He found you. He did the thing. He's done. He doesn't want to be inside anymore. He paused. I think it's the floors. His joints. Emily looked at the window. Tell Doyle to take him home. Let him sleep in Doyle's yard. She paused. And tell Doyle that I want to see him, Rex, when I'm discharged, wherever that is. I'll tell him. He left. Clara's 3 o'clock assessment came back with numbers that made Dr. Fontaine sit down and write for a long time in the chart, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one. And when Fontaine came to 214, she stood in the doorway and said, with the precision of a physician who had learned not to overpromise, her SAT is holding at 94 on reduced support. She's feeding. She responded to voice stimulus this morning. She paused. I'm cautiously... She stopped. She's doing well. I'll leave it there. Emily said, Thank you. Fontaine said, She's strong. Like someone I know. She left before Emily could respond to that, which was almost certainly intentional. At 4:15, Karen Solis from the compliance office came to 214. She came alone, which was unusual for compliance officers delivering significant news, and she sat in the chair with a folder and the expression of someone who had agreed to have this conversation in person rather than in writing, because they understood that this particular person deserved the in-person version. I want to update you on where the internal review stands, she said, informally. The formal report goes to the board tomorrow morning. Okay, Emily said. Douglas Pratt has been on administrative leave since 8 this morning. His leave has been converted to suspension pending investigation, effective this afternoon. She opened the folder. The investigation is formal. There are 2 aspects. The first is the HR matter, which involves the preparation of your PTO paperwork before the conversation in which you agreed to leave. That's a documentation integrity issue and potentially something more significant, depending on what the investigation finds. Emily was listening. The second aspect is a patient safety review. The safety officer has already issued a preliminary finding that the failure to conduct a basic wellness assessment on a pregnant staff member exhibiting visible symptoms during a shift constitutes a breach of workplace safety protocol. She paused. The finding will also note that the employee who raised the initial concern about a blood pressure check was the patient herself. There was also a dog, Emily said. Solis blinked. Then, with the barely perceptible softening of someone who has been reading incident reports all day and has found this particular detail unexpectedly human. Yes, the dog is in the report. She closed the folder. Walt Gibbons, the charge supervisor on duty, has also been suspended. He was present during the exchange and took no action and submitted a shift report that contained no notation of the incident. Emily looked at the window. And Teresa Rudd. Solis hesitated. Ms. Rudd has provided a statement. She says she prepared the paperwork at Pratt's direction and was told it was a pre-authorized accommodation request. That may be true, Emily said. Solis looked at her. It may be. She's 24 years old and she does what her supervisor tells her. I'm not interested in her. Emily paused. I'm interested in whether this happens to someone else. That's... Solis stopped. That's what the safety review is designed to prevent. Reviews don't prevent things, Emily said. Not unkindly. Culture prevents things. Policy prevents things. A review documents what already happened. She paused. Are the protocols going to change? That's a board decision. Then I'd like to speak to the board. Solis looked at her. I'm on a magnesium drip and my daughter is in the NICU. Yes, I'm aware. Emily looked at her steadily. When the board meets tomorrow, I'd like to speak. Solis sat with that for a moment. I'll convey the request. Thank you. Emily looked at the folder. One more thing. Yes? The journalist from the Tribune. They're going to file something with or without institutional cooperation. I'd recommend the board's public statement tomorrow be complete and specific rather than managed. She paused. Managed statements always leave room for the version of events that gets filled in by people who were there. Solis closed the folder. She looked at Emily for a moment. Not the look of a compliance officer assessing a risk. Something more direct than that. Ms. Voss, can I ask you something off the record? You can ask. Why are you still thinking about the institution? You're in a hospital bed. Your daughter is upstairs. You have... She gestured vaguely at the window, at wherever the military and federal presence had settled for the afternoon. You have quite a significant amount of external weight arriving on your behalf. You could let all of this unfold without, because the next person it happens to won't have a dog, Emily said. Solis was quiet. She'll just go home, Emily said, and she'll sit in her car in the parking lot with a blood pressure of 168 over 112, and she'll tell herself it's the shift and the fluorescence, and she'll drive home. She paused. I've been a nurse for 4 years. I almost did that. To myself. She looked at the window. That's why. Solis stood. She tucked the folder under her arm. The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning. She paused at the door. I'll make sure there's a chair at the table. She left. The afternoon ran down. Emily slept for an hour at 5. Genuinely slept. The sleep of someone whose body had finally made a demand that could not be deferred. Abby checked her BP at 6. 134 over 88. The best number since admission, and wrote it in the chart with slightly more flourish than strictly necessary. Hargrove came by at 7 with the news that the magnesium drip was being weaned overnight, and if her numbers held, she'd be off it by morning. At 7:30, Doyle came in alone. Rex was in his truck in the parking lot with the windows cracked, and what Doyle described as the expression of a dog who had fully retired for the evening. Doyle sat in the chair and they talked for 40 minutes. Not about Iron Ridge, not about the review board, not about any of it. They talked about a forward operating base in 2019 where the coffee had been universally terrible and someone had managed to acquire a guitar that nobody could play well, but everyone played anyway. They talked about 2 soldiers whose names Emily asked about, and Doyle answered carefully, the way you answer when some of the news is good and some of it isn't, and you're parceling it out. They talked about the specific indignity of the PCS process, and a supply sergeant who had once lost an entire pallet of equipment and blamed it on weather. Normal things. Old things. The texture of a shared past that didn't require explanation. At 8:15, Doyle said, Nolan's going back to Denver tomorrow. Emily looked at him. His shoulder. Follow up with ortho, and he's got a dog sitter situation he needs to resolve. Doyle paused. He wanted me to tell you he was glad Rex stopped. Tell him the same. Doyle looked at her. He's not bad, you know. I know. He spent the night in a plastic chair with a dog who snores. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Does he have people? Some. He's been out 3 years and I think he's still figuring out what that looks like. Doyle paused. He asked about you. Not in the way that requires a disclaimer, just, he asked if you were going to be okay. What did you tell him? I told him yes. He looked at her. You are, right? She thought about the magnesium drip being weaned and Clara's SAT at 94 and the board meeting at 9 tomorrow and the commendation in a document on her bedside table and Kwame's letter and 12 years of a dog's memory and 4 years of being ordinary in a place that didn't know what she was. Yeah, she said. I am. Doyle nodded. He stood. He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor for a moment in the way of people who have more to say than they know how to organize. Emily, for what it's worth, what you did in that valley, he stopped. Doyle. No, I need to. I know, she said. You don't have to. He looked at her. He nodded once. He left without saying anything else, which was the right call, and they both knew it. The night was quieter. The ER below ran its night operation. Clara's 9 o'clock assessment came back stable. Emily lay in the half-dark and thought about things in the non-linear way of someone whose body was healing and whose mind was doing what minds do in the space that recovery creates, moving through things not in order, but in whatever sequence the emotional weight demanded. She thought about the timestamp on Teresa Rudd's paperwork. 4 minutes before the conversation. 4 minutes, which meant the decision had been made before the discussion, which meant the discussion had been a performance, which meant Douglas Pratt had arrived at the nurses' station not to manage a situation, but to execute a decision he had already committed to, and she had stood there and made it easy for him by not fighting, because fighting would have required energy. She was running low on, and because she had, at that moment, believed, half believed, the compromise of a person who knows better but is tired enough to entertain the easier story, that maybe he was right. Maybe she was a liability. Maybe the right call was to go home. She had almost gone home. She lay in the dark with that. Then she thought about the rectangle of light on the floor, about Rex's tail moving once when she came off the elevator on the fourth floor, about Clara's hand. She closed her eyes. She slept. In the morning, Douglas Pratt made a mistake. It was not his first, but it was the one that mattered most, which is often how it works. The significant errors are rarely the dramatic ones. They're the procedural ones, the ones made in the ordinary course of trying to manage a problem that has already grown past manageable. He called Walt Gibbons. Gibbons, who was also on suspension, who was also the subject of an ongoing compliance review, who was also aware because he had been told, because the compliance office had been specific about what was and was not appropriate during the investigation period. That contact between suspended employees about the subject of an active internal review was not advisable. The call was 11 minutes long. Both of them had hospital-issued phones. Hospital phones on the institutional network logged call records automatically. This was standard, and both of them had known this for the entirety of their employment, which made the call either an error of significant proportion or an indication that they had not yet fully understood how serious the situation was. Karen Solis was informed of the call at 7:52 in the morning. She pulled the records. She called external legal counsel at 8:03. By 8:30, she had amended the scope of the compliance investigation to include potential witness coordination, which was a phrase with significant implications and which she had not expected to be writing when she had arrived at her office that morning. At 8:45, she called the board chair. The board meeting at 9 o'clock went differently than planned. Emily was transported to the board meeting room in a wheelchair. This had required a conversation with Hargrove, who had negotiated it on the terms that Emily would be accompanied by a nurse and would return to 214 within 90 minutes, regardless of the meeting's status. Emily had agreed to these terms without argument, which had made Hargrove slightly suspicious, but the agreement held. The boardroom was on the third floor, a room designed to project institutional authority. Long table, upholstered chairs, a screen at the far end, windows overlooking the hospital's main entrance. There were 8 board members, and Karen Solis and the external counsel. And by arrangement of a phone call the previous evening that Emily had not been party to, Colonel Haas and Agent Reeves. Emily came in the wheelchair. The nurse, not Abby, a quieter woman named Petra, who seemed to have been selected for this particular task precisely because of her capacity for stillness, positioned her at the end of the table where a space had been cleared. Haas was to her left. Reeves was across. The board chair, a man named Gerald Park, who had the careful neutrality of someone trying to hold a room together by sheer will, opened the meeting. Emily did not speak first. She let the compliance report go. She let the legal counsel walk through the preliminary findings. She listened to the safety officer's report with the attention of a nurse reviewing a case file. Not her case, some other nurses, some other set of facts that happened to include her name and her blood pressure and the timestamp on a PTO form. When it was her turn, she said, "I want to talk about protocols." Park looked at her. "Ms. Voss, I think the board would like to first express, I appreciate that," she said, "and I'll receive it, but I'd like to start with protocols because that's the part that affects the next person." A pause. Park nodded. She spoke for 12 minutes. She was precise, and she was not emotional, and she was not dramatic. She talked about the specific failure points in the existing system, the absence of a formal wellness check mechanism for staff working extended shifts in late-stage pregnancy, the structural dynamic that made it difficult for a charge supervisor's call to be questioned by floor staff, the gap between HR accommodation policy and how that policy was actually communicated and applied. She talked about what she had noticed in her own body and hadn't acted on, and she was honest about that without being self-flagellating, because the point wasn't her failure. The point was a system in which her failure was entirely predictable. She said, "The dog noticed. That's the system failure. The backup was a dog." Nobody laughed. The board member on Park's right wrote something. She said, "I want a formal wellness protocol for pregnant staff working clinical shifts. I want a mandatory peer review process for accommodation decisions. And I want it done before the next quarter, not as a goal but as a deliverable." She paused. "Those are my 3 asks. Whatever the board decides about the individuals involved, those are what I'm asking for." Park looked at his colleagues. The board member who'd been writing looked up. "We can do that," she said. Her name was Dr. Anita Sorensen, and she had the air of someone who had been waiting for the meeting to arrive at the substantive part. Those are achievable within the timeline. Then we're agreed, Emily said. What followed was 45 minutes that Emily was largely absent from in the room energy sense, because the board moved into the portion of the meeting that concerned the individuals, and that portion was detailed and institutional, and she had already said what she had to say about it, which was that she was not filing a personal action, and that what the institution did with its own people was the institution's business. And she trusted the process, which was not naive. She knew that processes were imperfect and slow and frequently disappointing, but it was true. Haas spoke about the federal observation of the incident, which carried different weight than the internal report. Reeves provided a one-paragraph formal statement. The external counsel noted that the preliminary finding on the PTO documentation irregularity was significant. At 9:54, Park made a formal statement. Douglas Pratt's employment was being terminated pending the outcome of the formal investigation, with cause cited as documentation falsification and breach of duty of care. Walt Gibbons was similarly terminated. The compliance file on the 11-minute phone call would be referred to the hospital's HR legal team for further review. He said the hospital would be issuing a formal public apology to Emily Voss. Emily looked at the table. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I'd like the apology to go to the staff of the emergency department before it goes public. They were there. They should hear it first." Park looked at her. Yes, we can do that. Thank you." She looked at Hargrove, who had come in at some point during the back half of the meeting and was standing near the door with the expression of someone who has decided this falls within the 90-minute window. "I'd like to go back to my daughter now." Hargrove moved the wheelchair. On the way out, Reeves fell into step beside her briefly. "The Tribune journalist, I took a call from them this morning." Emily looked at her. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing classified. I confirmed federal presence and said it was a matter of ongoing official business." She paused. "But I gave them your direct number." Emily stopped the chair. "You did what?" "They're going to write the story. It's going to happen." Reeves looked at her with the flat certainty of someone who has spent years managing information and knows which forces are bigger than management. "You said you wanted to control your narrative. That requires talking to them." Emily looked at her for a long moment. "You gave my number to a journalist." "A good one. I checked." "Without asking me." "You were in a board meeting." Emily looked at Reeves. Reeves looked back. There was a quality to Reeves's expression that was neither apologetic nor entirely unapologetic, more like a person who has made a call they believe is correct and is prepared to be wrong about it. "Fine," Emily said. "Fine?" "I'll talk to them." She gestured at Petra to continue. "After Clara's noon assessment." They went back upstairs. Clara's noon assessment was the best one yet. SAT holding at 96 on minimal support, feeding improving, and Dr. Fontaine using the word encouraging with the careful specificity of someone who had decided it was now accurate enough to deploy. Emily sat with her for the hour before lunch and talked to her in the low, steady voice of a person who is aware that what they are saying doesn't matter yet, and will always matter. A voice for the incubator, and the tubes, and the monitors, and the small perfect hand, and the morning light coming through the fourth-floor window. At 1:30 she called the journalist. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was 31, and he had a voice that had clearly been trained by years of asking people things they didn't initially want to answer. He was careful, and he was specific, and he asked good questions, which she found she could respect even in the context of being the subject of them. She answered them for 22 minutes. She was factual. She mentioned the protocols she'd requested. She did not characterize anyone by name. She talked about Rex. She talked about Rex with more specificity than she'd planned to, because the question had been good, and the answer was long, and the full answer was the important one. She said, "At the end, the story isn't about me. It's about what almost happened and what needed to change so it doesn't." Webb was quiet for a moment. "Can I quote that?" "Yes." "Thank you, Ms. Voss." She ended the call. She put the phone on the bedside table. The magnesium drip had been reduced to its final rate. By evening, she'd be off it entirely. And the forecast from there, barring a new development, was 2 more days of monitoring and then discharge. She looked at the document from Haas, still on the table. The commendation, the formal language of the review board, the record correction that would take 4 to 6 weeks to finalize. She thought about the reprimand. 4 years of it sitting in a file somewhere. a permanent characterization of what had happened in that valley. 4 years of knowing it was there and choosing every day not to spend her energy fighting it because the energy was finite and the patients in front of her were real and the dog in the kennel was learning things that nobody had authorized. 4 years of being ordinary, of staying late and charting medications and knowing which patients were afraid of needles, of being a nurse in an emergency room where nobody knew what she had been. The Tribune article would change that. The board's public apology would change that. The commendation would change that. She wasn't sure how she felt about that yet. She would figure it out in the way she figured most things out, not in advance, but in the course of what came next. At 3:50, Nolan appeared in the doorway. He had his jacket on, the sling still in place, a bag over his good shoulder. "Heading out?" she said. "Ortho appointment at 5:30, and Rex needs his own bed." He came in. He stood near the window. "Doyle's downstairs if you need anything. He's staying another day." "I know." She looked at him. "You didn't have to come by. I was on this floor anyway." He paused. "Clara's update." "She's doing well." "Good." He looked at the document on the table. "Is that the commendation?" "Yes." He looked at it for a moment. "Are you going to frame it?" She considered. "No." "File it?" "Probably." He nodded. That seemed right to him. "Do you need anything before I go?" She thought about it. "No." He moved toward the door, stopped. This had become a pattern with him, and she found she didn't mind it, the stopping, the afterthought that wasn't an afterthought. "For the record," he said, "you weren't a liability." She looked at him. "I know. I know you know." He paused. "I'm saying it anyway." He left. She looked at the window for a while. The afternoon light, the city below, ordinary, indifferent, continuing. At 5:40, her phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Colorado area code. The message was short. "This is Marcus Webb. One more thing. My editor wants to know if there are photos of the dog for the article." She stared at the message for a moment. Then, for the first time in approximately 36 hours, she laughed. A real one, brief, that cost her less than she'd expected. She typed, "Talk to Sergeant First Class Doyle. He's in the parking lot." She put the phone down. She picked up the commendation document. She read it again, properly this time, the way she hadn't been able to the first 2 times because the first 2 times there had been too much else happening. She read the language of the review board's findings, the formal, specific, bureaucratically careful language of an institution attempting to say something true in the vocabulary available to it. She read the sentence that said, "The actions of Staff Sergeant Emily Voss during the Iron Ridge evacuation are hereby recognized as demonstrating exceptional judgment, tactical competence, and commitment to the preservation of human life under conditions of significant professional risk." She put the document back on the table. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, exceptional judgment. She had made a call, a fast one, in a valley, with incomplete information and a clock running down, and civilians who were not her responsibility and soldiers who were. She had made the call that her judgment said was right, and she had lived with everything that came after it. The review, the reprimand, the resignation, 4 years of silence, one dog's memory, one evening in an emergency room. And she thought quietly, without drama, without the weight she might have expected, "I'd do it again." She closed her eyes. She was almost asleep when her phone buzzed a second time. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, not Colorado. The area code was Washington, D.C. She answered. A pause. A different kind of voice from any she'd heard in the last 2 days. Older, measured, with the specific authority of someone who was accustomed to being the most significant caller in any given conversation. "Ms. Voss, this is Deputy Undersecretary Halloran, Office of the Secretary of Defense. I apologize for the hour." A pause. "I'd like to talk to you about something the review board surfaced in its findings. Something that goes beyond the commendation." Emily opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling. "How far beyond?" she said. Another pause. Longer this time. "We'd like you to come to Washington," Halloran said, "when you're well enough to travel. There are people here who want to discuss the medical detection program you designed, not just formally recognizing it, implementing it, nationally." He stopped. "The secretary has been briefed." Emily said nothing for a long moment. Ms. Voss? My daughter is on respiratory support in the NICU, she said. She's 33 weeks and 4 days old, and she is not going anywhere for the foreseeable future, and neither am I. Of course, we're not asking for... But, Emily said. A pause. When she's ready, Emily said. I'll come. She ended the call. She put the phone on the bedside table. She looked at the window. The city. The evening coming. She thought about the 6 months she'd spent in a training facility with a young Malinois, on her own time, running a protocol nobody had authorized, for no reason except that she had read the research and believed it was possible, and nobody was going to do it if she didn't. She thought about the dog who had remembered 4 years later. She thought about the phrase nationally and what that meant in the context of working dogs and field medicine, and the gap between what the research said was possible and what the institutional machinery had gotten around to formalizing. She looked at this commendation on the bedside table. Then she looked at her phone. She picked it up and texted Doyle. When you talk to the journalist about Rex, make sure he gets the training right. The full 6 months. All of it. The response came in 2 minutes. You sure? She typed, it's the important part. She set the phone down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, Washington. And then she thought about Clara, 3 floors up, lungs working, hand gripping, small and exact and entirely herself. She thought, first things first. The evening settled. The hospital ran its quiet operation. Somewhere in the building, in the files of the compliance office, 14 months of security footage waited for review. In the parking lot, Doyle was presumably talking to a journalist about a dog. In Denver, Nolan Marsh was in an ortho waiting room with a sling and a dog who needed a better bed. In a file at the Army Records Center, a reprimand was being flagged for removal. And in a room on the 4th floor, in Bay 3 of the NICU, Clara Voss was breathing. On her own, mostly. More than yesterday. More than... The monitor beside her showed a number that Dr. Fontaine, reviewing it from the nursing station at 6:15, marked in the chart, and then paused over for a moment before writing one word in the margin, strong. Fontaine's single word stayed in the margin of the chart overnight, and by morning it had become a forecast. Clara's 6 o'clock assessment showed SAT at 97 on minimal support, the kind of number that makes a neonatologist sit with it for a moment before writing anything, not because it's uncertain, but because it's better than the cautious version of events, and better always requires a second look to confirm it's real. Fontaine confirmed it was real at 6:40 and adjusted the support settings downward with the specific economy of a physician, reducing something that is no longer carrying as much weight as it was. Emily was awake for the 6 o'clock. She'd been awake since 5:30, lying in the particular early morning alertness of someone whose body has been through significant difficulty and has decided that sleep is now a luxury rather than a requirement. The magnesium drip was gone, off since 11 the previous night, and the absence of it made her feel more like herself, and also made the world have sharper edges, which was uncomfortable and correct. When Fontaine came to 214 with the morning numbers, Emily already had her tablet and was reading the chart remotely, which Fontaine acknowledged with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this. 97, Emily said. 97, Fontaine confirmed. Reduced support. Yes. Emily set the tablet down. She looked at the window. When? Fontaine didn't ask what she meant. She knew what she meant. If she holds at this rate, I'd say we're looking at extubation in the next 48 to 72 hours. After that, another week minimum for feeding and weight. So, she paused. 3 weeks. Maybe 2.5 if she keeps pushing. She'll push, Emily said. Fontaine looked at her. Yeah, she said, I think she will. She moved toward the door. Your discharge is looking like tomorrow afternoon, assuming your BP continues. We'll talk about monitoring protocol for the next 4 weeks before you go. I'll need to be near the NICU. We have a family accommodation room on the 4th floor. It's not comfortable, but it's there. I've slept in worse, Emily said. Fontaine left. Emily looked at the morning light on the wall and thought about 2.5 weeks and what that meant in terms of the practical architecture of her life. Her apartment, her car, her plants, which were almost certainly dead, a refrigerator that needed to be emptied, a return-to-work timeline that was now a conversation for a later month. She thought about Washington and Deputy Undersecretary Halloran's measured voice. She thought about the word nationally and the distance between a 6-month unsanctioned training program in a military facility and a formal federally implemented protocol. She thought, one thing at a time. The Tribune article ran that morning. Marcus Webb had filed late the previous evening, and his editor had moved it to the front of the digital edition, which meant it was live at 6 a.m., and had accumulated, by the time Emily saw it at 7:15, a number of comments that she read the first 3 of, before deciding that comments were not where she should be spending her morning. The article itself was good. She read it twice. Webb had gotten the sequence right, had gotten Rex's role right, had been specific about the training in a way that was accurate without being sensationalized, and had quoted her directly. The story isn't about me, it's about what almost happened, and what needed to change so it doesn't, as the final line, which meant it was the thing the reader carried out with them, which she understood was a deliberate editorial choice and was glad of it. He had also, in the 4th paragraph, named Douglas Pratt. Not with characterization. He'd been careful, the language was factual and conditional, has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but named, with the timestamp on the PTO paperwork described in enough specific detail that anyone reading it would understand what the timestamp meant. Teresa Rudd was not named. Emily had said, in the 22 minutes, that the administrative coordinator had acted under direction, and she did not consider her part of the problem. Webb had honored that. The article had a photograph. Not Emily. She hadn't offered one, and he hadn't asked. It was Rex. Doyle had apparently managed the parking lot conversation with both competence and enthusiasm, because the photograph showed Rex sitting in the ER waiting area in the blue plastic chair with Nolan's hand resting on his back, and the old dog's eyes looking directly at the camera with the unreadable ancient attention that 12-year-old working dogs have. And it was... Emily looked at it for a long moment. It was exactly right. Her phone had 14 messages by 7:30. She read 2 of them, both from colleagues at Harlow Regional, both versions of "I had no idea," and "I'm so sorry, and please let us know what you need." She would respond to them eventually. Not today. At 8:15, Doyle came in with coffee from a place that was not the hospital cafeteria, which she accepted with a gratitude that was out of proportion to the coffee, but not to the gesture. "The article," she said. "I saw it." He sat. "Webb was fair." "He was." She looked at him. "You gave him a good photo." "Rex gave him a good photo. I just held the leash." He drank his coffee. "There's something you should know. 2 things." She waited. "Pratt gave a statement to the Tribune last night, after your interview. Webb called him for comment, and he gave a statement." "What did he say?" Doyle looked at his cup. "He said the early departure was a mutual agreement reached out of concern for your well-being, and that the blood pressure check was initiated by his staff at his direction." Emily was quiet for a moment. "The security footage is in the article. Webb described it specifically." He paused. "Pratt's statement is in the article, too. In the same paragraph as the timestamp on the PTO paperwork." She looked at the window. "He put them in the same paragraph." "Webb's good." Doyle paused. "The second thing. The formal compliance report was released this morning. The hospital posted it publicly. Board decision, transparency initiative. It's on the hospital website." "I know. Hargrove texted me." "Did she tell you about the finding on the PTO documentation?" "The falsification determination." Emily nodded. "Yes. That changes the administrative leave to termination for cause, which means no severance," Emily said, "and it's on record." She paused. "Good." Doyle looked at her. "You're very calm about this." "I'm very tired," she said. "They're not the same thing, but they look similar from the outside." She drank the coffee. "Where's Rex?" Doyle's truck. "He won't come inside anymore." He said it the way he'd said it the day before, simply, without the weight of meaning more than it meant. "I think he's done with the building. He did his thing." "He did his thing," she agreed. "I'm heading back to Fort Carson this afternoon. I've been out a week longer than I planned." He stood. "But I'll be back. When she's ready to come home. I want to be here for that." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He put his coffee cup down. "Emily, you spent 6 months teaching my dog to save lives on your own time, and then you left and never said a word about it, and he remembered anyway. The least I can do is show up." She looked at her hands. "Doyle," she said. "Yeah." Take care of him, his joints. He needs the bed, he said. I got him a bed. Good. She paused. An elevated one. Off the floor. It's better for the hips. I know. He picked up his jacket. He stood in the doorway for a moment. For what it's worth, the men from the unit, the ones who gave statements. 3 of them reached out to me last night, after the article. They want to... He stopped. They want to write to her, to Clara, when she's old enough. Emily looked up. You don't have to say yes, he said quickly. It's not a request. I'm just telling you. She was quiet for a long moment. Tell them yes, she said. When she's old enough to read them. He nodded. He left. She sat with the empty coffee cup and the morning and the sound of the hospital going about its work. At 9:15, Karen Solis sent a formal email confirming that Douglas Pratt's termination was effective immediately, that the compliance investigation's falsification finding had been referred to the Colorado Department of Labor and to the State Nursing Board, not because Emily had requested it, but because falsification of medical documentation was a matter that the institution was legally obligated to refer, and that Walt Gibbons had been terminated the previous evening following the review of the phone call records. The email had a second section. It was brief. It said that the hospital's formal public apology had been delivered to the ER staff at 8 a.m. that morning at shift change, in the manner Emily had requested, in person, to the department, before anything went public. The board chair had done it himself. Emily read that section twice. Then she opened a new email and wrote to Karen Solis. Thank you for the order of that. It mattered. She sent it. At 10 o'clock, she was transported to the NICU. She was in the wheelchair again. This would be the last time, probably, because the morning BP had been 128/82, and Hargrove had the look of someone preparing to remove a restriction, and she sat with Clara for 2 hours. The support had been reduced again during the morning rounds. Clara was breathing with it rather than against it, the NICU nurse explained, which was the language they used for a baby whose own drive was outpacing the assistant's. She's working, the nurse said. She's always working, Emily said. She's been working since Tuesday. The nurse smiled. She gets it from somewhere. Emily sat with her hand through the access port and Clara's hand around her finger, and the monitors running their updated commentary. Better numbers, improved numbers, numbers that were not yet outside the woods but were moving in a direction that the woods ended. She talked to her in the same low voice. She told her about the coffee Doyle had brought, and about Rex in the parking lot, and about a letter she was going to write to a 12-year-old boy in another country when she found the right words. She talked about the apartment, and the dead plants, and how they were going to fix that, the 2 of them. She talked about the job she was going to go back to, and the things she was going to change about it, and what it meant to be a nurse who understood what it felt like to be a patient, which was not a lesson she'd chosen, but which she was going to use. She talked about Washington. I'm going to take you with me, she said quietly. Eventually. When you're ready. I want you to see the building where the decisions get made. So you know it's just a building. Clara's hand tightened briefly. Reflex, not intention, but there it was. The formal hearing before the Military Oversight Committee happened 11 days later in Washington, without Emily present. She had given a written statement, 6 pages, specific, factual, covering the events of Iron Ridge with the same precision she'd used in every report she'd ever written, which was the precision of someone who understood that documentation was the architecture of accountability. Colonel Haas had submitted his own statement. The 7 soldiers from the unit had submitted theirs. The review board had already made its recommendation, but the oversight committee required a formal proceeding before the recommendation became official record. The proceeding took 4 hours. Emily spent those 4 hours in the NICU family accommodation room on the 4th floor, which was not comfortable. Fontaine had been accurate about that. With a view of the parking structure and a chair that had a broken armrest. She had her laptop and a cup of bad coffee, and Clara 3 doors down. Reeves called her at 2:15 Mountain Time. It's done, Reeves said. Emily looked at the parking structure. All of it? All of it. The reprimand is struck from record, effective today. The commendation is officially filed. The medical detection program has been formally recognized as an innovative field medicine initiative, and the Army has authorized a working group to develop it into a formal protocol. That'll take 2 years minimum, but the authorization is real. A pause. And there's a separate letter from the secretary. Emily was quiet. You don't have to read it right away, Reeves said. I'll read it. I know you will. Reeves paused. Halloran still wants the Washington meeting. When you're ready. I know. I'll be ready in about 2 weeks. She paused. Reeves. Yeah. The first time you came into Bay One, you said my daughter was going to be okay. A silence. I did. You had no medical basis for that. No. Why did you say it? Reeves was quiet for a moment. Because it needed to be true, she said finally. And sometimes you say the thing that needs to be true, and you let the rest of it work itself out. Emily thought about that. That's not very intelligence agency of you. No, Reeves agreed. It's not. She hung up. Clara came off respiratory support on day 14. It happened at 7:20 in the morning, a Tuesday, and it was not dramatic in the way of television medicine. No sudden moment, no single breath that changed everything. It was gradual and then complete. Fontaine made the call, the respiratory therapist removed the equipment, and Clara breathed. On her own, fully, with the unceremonious competence of a small person who has been doing the work all along and finally has the room to show it. Emily was there. She had been there since 6, in the rocking chair that the NICU kept beside Bay 3 now, because the nurses had collectively decided it should be there, in the way that hospital staff make unofficial adjustments that are never formally authorized and always practically necessary. She watched her daughter breathe. She had nothing to say. Some things don't require narration from the person experiencing them. She sat in the rocking chair and she watched Clara's chest rise and fall without assistance, and she was present in the way that is different from being alert or being watchful, present in the full, quiet sense, the kind that doesn't require anything. After a while, she took out her phone. She opened a new message to a number she'd saved 2 weeks ago. She typed, "She's breathing on her own." The response came from Nolan in 40 seconds. Good. Then after a pause, Rex had a good morning too. Chased a squirrel. Didn't catch it, but seemed satisfied anyway. Emily looked at the message. She looked at Clara. She typed, "Tell him he's still the best diagnostic tool this hospital ever had." The response? "He knows." She put the phone away. The discharge came on day 16. Emily had spent 14 of those nights in the family accommodation room and 2 back in 214 for monitoring when her BP had ticked up during a stressful afternoon. The Washington logistics, the written statement, an interview with a nursing trade publication that Hargrove had forwarded her with the note, "You should do this. I'm not saying that lightly," and had come back down within 24 hours, which Hargrove noted in the chart as resolved, no intervention required. Patient is a nurse and knows what to do, which is the best and most complicated thing about her. Emily read that note when she accessed her chart. She did not comment on it. Clara's discharge came 3 days after Emily's. 23 days after she was born, at 36 weeks corrected gestational age, weighing 2 kilograms and 400 grams, with lungs that the respiratory therapist described as punching above their weight class, which Clara's mother found, privately, both accurate and entirely appropriate. Doyle drove up from Fort Carson. He stood in the NICU discharge area with Rex on a leash outside the glass doors. The dog would not come inside, had not come inside since the first night, which everyone had accepted as a reasonable position for a 12-year-old dog with opinions, and watched Emily carry Clara through the lobby in the specific too careful way of a person holding something they have spent several weeks being terrified about and are now terrified to move. Rex saw them through the glass. His tail started moving when Emily was still 15 feet away. He stood up, slowly, with the visible effort of a dog whose joints had opinions of their own, and pressed his nose to the glass. Emily came through the doors and crouched, carefully, with a lot of her core that was still in recovery, and held Clara so that Rex could see her. Not touch. Not yet. Just see. Rex looked at the baby for a long moment. His tail moved in the slow, deliberate way that was different from excitement. Something more settled, something that was closer to completion. Doyle looked at them. He looked at the glass doors of Harlow Regional Medical Center. He looked at the parking lot, the ordinary Thursday morning, the city going about its business. He cleared his throat. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," Emily said. She straightened. She looked at the building once, at the ER entrance, the sliding doors, the small camera above them whose footage had spent 2 weeks in a compliance report and was now, presumably, back to being ordinary security footage. She thought about the nurse's station, the blood pressure cuff, the specific quality of Abby's face when she'd read the number on the screen. She thought about Douglas Pratt's voice saying, "Look at yourself," and she thought about herself looking at him and deciding not to fight. And she thought about how close that had been. She would think about how close it had been for a long time, not obsessively, but honestly. Because the honest version of events was useful and the managed version wasn't, and she had learned that specific lesson in a valley 4 years ago and had been learning it in different forms ever since. She turned from the building. She walked to the car. The Washington meeting happened 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday in November when the capital had the particular gray-bright quality of a city that doesn't quite admit to having seasons. Emily took Clara, as promised. They stayed 2 nights in a hotel that was fine. Clara was unimpressed by Washington, which Emily found appropriate. Deputy Undersecretary Halloran was, as his voice had suggested, older, measured, with the careful authority of someone who had spent decades in the architecture of institutional decision-making and had developed an efficient relationship with it. He had a conference room with other people in it, Army medical officers, a Department of Defense liaison, 2 people whose precise function Emily was not entirely clear on but whose attentiveness suggested significance. And they sat around a table and talked for 3 hours about what a formal military working dog medical detection program would look like and who should build it. Emily had a folder. She had spent 4 weeks preparing the folder. It contained the original notes from the 6 months with Rex, which she had kept on a hard drive and had not looked at in 4 years, and which turned out to be more detailed than she remembered, because she had known, even then, that the work was real, and real work deserved documentation, even when the institution wasn't ready to receive it. The folder also contained a literature review, 3 case studies she had assembled from publicly available military medicine research, and a proposed 8-month pilot program structure. She put the folder on the table. Halloran looked at it. He looked at her. "You came prepared." "I've been prepared for a while," she said. "The meeting took some time to schedule." He opened the folder. He read the first page. He passed it to the Army medical officer on his left, who read the first page and passed it to the next person. Emily watched it go around the table. Nobody said anything for the first pass. Then the Army medical officer, a colonel named Birch, who had the forthright energy of someone who spent her professional life translating between clinical reality and administrative possibility, looked up. 8 months is too fast," Birch said. 8 months is what's needed," Emily said. "I ran the pilot in 6 with 1 dog and no funding. 8 months with a proper structure and a team is not aggressive." Birch looked at her. Something in the look was evaluative and then decided. "Fair," she said. The meeting ran long. They ordered lunch. Clara slept through most of it in a carrier on Emily's chest, which nobody in the room commented on directly, but which seemed to make the room slightly less formal than conference rooms usually are, which Emily thought was probably useful. By 2:30 they had a framework, not a commitment. Frameworks were not commitments, and Emily was clear-eyed about the distance between a framework and a functioning program, and the specific kind of patience required to close that distance. But the framework was real, and the authorization was real, and Halloran signed a document before she left the building that moved the pilot program from proposal to pending, which in Washington meant it existed. She walked out of the building into the November afternoon with Clara against her chest and a signed document in her folder and the gray-bright sky overhead. She stood on the steps for a moment. She thought about what it would mean, not in the abstract, but in the specific. Working dog units in forward-deployed positions with medical detection capability. Medics who knew what the dogs could do. Soldiers who might not know they were symptomatic until a dog sat down in front of them and refused to move. She thought about the chain of it. 1 dog, 1 valley, 1 woman who had stayed late on her own time, and how long that chain was, and how it had taken 4 years and a medical emergency, and a compliance report, and a review board, and a 12-year-old boy's letter to make visible what had always been there. She looked at the building. She thought, all of this, because a dog remembered. Then she thought, no, all of this because I taught him what to look for. And then I left. And he kept looking. She walked to the hotel. In December, Harlow Regional Medical Center held a staff recognition event. It was not glamorous. A Tuesday afternoon in the hospital's main conference room with bad catering and a slide presentation that had 3 typos in it and a program that ran 12 minutes longer than planned. Emily stood at the front of the room in her scrubs because she'd come straight from a half shift that the department had officially started calling her transition back, and she looked at the staff assembled around the tables, and she said the following, without notes. I know most of you knew me as someone who stayed late and remembered your patients' names and didn't cause problems. I want to tell you that being that person is enough. That's the job. That's what patients need from us. She paused. I also want to tell you that I almost didn't come back, not because of what happened to me, because I wasn't sure the building deserved me back. She looked around the room. And then I thought about Bay 4, the man with the elevated troponin, and I thought, someone has to be here for him. Someone has to know what to look for. She stopped. That's why I'm here, not for recognition, because the next patient needs someone paying attention. The room was quiet. Patricia, the charge nurse who had managed the board with 11 years of experience and who did not have an expressive face, had an expressive face. Emily sat down. The program went on. There was a formal announcement about the new wellness protocol for pregnant staff, which the board had passed in its entirety, and which included a mandatory peer review provision for accommodation decisions made during clinical shifts. Dr. Anita Sorensen presented it. The protocol was named, not after Emily, because Emily had said no to that specifically, but for the date it was enacted, which was the date after the compliance report was finalized, which meant the date had its own memory even without a name on it. The second announcement was about a memorial, not a plaque. The hospital had decided against a plaque, which was Emily's recommendation, because plaques were things people walked past. What the hospital had decided on was the partnership with the Army Working Dog Unit at Fort Carson and a training exchange program for ER staff, the first of its kind between a civilian hospital and a military installation, focused on the intersection of animal behavior and emergency medical detection. The program would place a military working dog in the hospital 2 days per month for staff training and familiarization. The dog selected for the inaugural year of the program was not Rex. Rex was 12. Rex was retired. Rex was in Doyle's yard with an elevated bed and a blanket and a squirrel problem that, from all available evidence, he was handling with enthusiasm, if not success. The dog selected was a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois named Ava, currently in active service at Fort Carson, whose handler had volunteered for the program after reading the Tribune article on a Tuesday morning in October and emailing the program coordinator within 40 minutes of finishing it. Emily met Ava at the recognition event. Ava's handler, a young sergeant named Torres who had the contained energy of someone who was very good at her job and knew it without making it a personality trait, brought her in on a working leash, and Ava moved through the conference room with the alert attention of an animal assessing a new environment and deciding within 90 seconds that it was manageable. She came to Emily directly. Not the way Rex had come to her. Rex had known her. Ava had never seen her, but working dogs have a particular sensitivity to attention, and Emily's attention was complete, and Ava responded to that with the directness of an animal who didn't waste time on social ceremony. She sat in front of Emily and looked at her. Emily crouched. She held out her hand, back of it forward, the way you offer yourself to a working dog. Ava assessed it, made her decision, pressed her nose once into Emily's palm. Torres watched this. She doesn't do that with everyone. I know, Emily said. She stood. She looked at Ava, 3 years old, ears perfect, eyes sharp and dark and busy with the work of reading the room, all of it ahead of her, all the things she was capable of that nobody had formalized yet. We're going to teach you some new things, Emily said quietly. Ava's tail moved once, decided. The year turned. Clara grew. She grew the way babies grow when they've had to work for it from the beginning, steadily, with a kind of determined accumulation that made every milestone feel earned in a way that it always is and rarely gets acknowledged. By March, she was 3 months corrected and had the specific personality of a person who had already decided she had opinions and was going to express them, and Emily would look at her sometimes and think, 33 weeks and 4 days, and she came out like this, and the thought was not pride exactly, more like recognition, like looking in a mirror that showed you something you'd already suspected. Nolan came back in February. He did not announce it as a visit, exactly. He had a meeting in Denver and drove the extra hour and called from the parking lot, which was the kind of thing he did, arriving without staging a scene about it. Emily brought Clara downstairs to the lobby because the elevator was being serviced, and they stood in the lobby, and Clara regarded Nolan with the flat assessment of a 3-month-old who has not yet developed social accommodation, and Nolan regarded Clara with the expression of a person trying to look composed in the presence of something very small and very consequential. "She has your eyes," he said. "She has her own eyes," Emily said. "She's just borrowed the color." He looked at Emily. She looked at him. There was between them the specific quality of two people who had met in unusual circumstances and had subsequently kept in low-key but consistent contact, and had each been thinking about what the other one was actually like in ordinary life, which is always a different question from what a person is like in a crisis. "I'm going to be in Denver more," he said. "I took a consulting position, medical training for first responders." Emily looked at him. "That's not an accident." "No," he said. "It's not." Clara made a sound. Both of them looked at her. She looked back with the authoritative indifference of a person who had not requested to be included in this conversation. "She's going to be a handful," Nolan said. "She's going to be exactly who she is," Emily said. "That's the plan." He smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him actually smile, as opposed to the more minor expressions she'd catalogued in the previous weeks, and it changed his face in a way she filed and didn't comment on. Rex died in April. It happened quietly. Doyle sent a message on a Saturday morning, brief and specific the way Doyle communicated, and Emily read it at the kitchen table with Clara in the high chair, and the morning light coming through the windows of the new apartment, the one closer to the hospital, the one with better light and a yard access that she had specified for reasons she hadn't explained to the landlord. She sat with it for a while. She thought about a 12-year-old dog pressing his nose into her palm in a hospital waiting room. She thought about the 6 months in the training facility. She thought about the specific quality of his attention, not mystical, not inexplicable, but trained, the product of time and patience, and someone deciding that what was possible was worth the effort even when nobody had asked them to make the effort. She thought about what Doyle had said. He was never quite the same after she left. She thought, neither was I. She wrote to Doyle. She wrote to Kwame. The letter she'd been drafting and revising for months, which was now finally exactly what she wanted to say, which was not a lot. She told him she was glad he was 12. She told him about Clara. She told him that the program that had come from that valley and that dog was being built now, slowly and imperfectly, and with significant administrative friction, and that when it was finished it would have his name somewhere in the acknowledgments because it had started with him, in the sense that all things start with the person who makes the reason real. She sent the letter. She picked Clara up from the high chair. She took her to the yard. It was April in Colorado, which meant cold mornings and the tentative possibility of something warmer on the other side, the kind of weather that hasn't decided yet. Clara, 5 months corrected now, had the expression she always had outside, acute attention, everything interesting, the world still new enough to require full assessment. Emily sat on the steps with her and thought about the things she knew now that she hadn't known in October. She knew that the program was real and would take 2 more years to implement, and would be imperfect when it was implemented, and would save someone's life in that imperfect form, which was how things worked. She knew that Douglas Pratt's falsification finding had resulted in the referral of his case to the Colorado Department of Labor, which had opened its own investigation, and that the outcome of that investigation, still pending, would determine whether the falsification affected his ability to work in a healthcare administrative capacity again. She did not know what the outcome would be. She knew that the referral existed. She knew that the timestamp on the PTO paperwork existed in a compliance report that was now public record, and that public records had a long life. She knew that Walt Gibbons had not found employment in another hospital because the compliance report was public, and that public records had that same long life for everyone named in them. She knew that the wellness protocol at Harlow Regional had been reviewed and adopted in modified form by 2 other hospitals in Colorado, because she had received emails from their risk management offices asking about the implementation and had answered them. She knew that she was going back to full duty in 2 weeks, that she was going back as a staff nurse and not as anything with a title, because she had declined the offer of a formal program director position on the grounds that she belonged in the ER and not in administration, and the board had accepted this with the slight confusion of an institution that did not fully understand a person who understood their own purpose. She knew that Nolan was in Denver and drove the extra hour on Tuesdays. She knew that Ava, the 3-year-old Malinois from Fort Carson, had in her second month of the hospital training program demonstrated an unprompted response to a patient in the lobby who had presented with subtle signs of hypoglycemia that the triage nurse had not yet assessed, and that the response had been documented and added to the program file, and that Colonel Birch had sent her a single-line email that read, "Your pilot data is building itself." She looked at Clara. Clara looked at the yard, at the pale April sky, at a bird that landed briefly on the fence and then left. Emily thought about what she would tell her eventually, when eventually arrived. Not the institutional version, not the commendation, not the formal proceeding, not the compliance report and the terminated supervisors and the Washington meeting. The actual version. The version that started with a woman who was tired and pregnant and had been told she was done for the day and who had almost believed it, and who had been shown otherwise by an old dog who had learned to look for the things she'd taught him to look for. The version that said, you are going to be told, at some point, by someone with a title and a tablet and a certainty that is not as earned as it sounds, that you are a liability, that you are too much or not enough or the wrong kind of presence for the room you're in. And you are going to have to decide, Bob, not once, but a lot of times, in different rooms and with different people, and with more or less evidence available to you, whether the person with the title and the tablet is right. Sometimes they'll be right, that's important to know. But sometimes they'll be wrong, and the question is whether you know the difference, and whether you trust yourself enough to act on it, and whether you have the patience to let the truth catch up, because it does catch up, it always does, though not always as fast as you need it to. She would tell her, I made a call in a valley. I made a call in a hospital. Neither of them felt certain in the moment. Both of them were right, and both of them cost me something, and I'd pay both costs again because the alternative was someone who didn't make the call, and that's not who I am. She would tell her, you're going to be that person, the one who makes the call. I know this because I watched you spend 23 days becoming someone who breathes entirely on her own, and you were about it from day one. Clara turned her head and looked at Emily. The yard. The morning. The pale sky deciding what kind of day to be. Emily thought about Rex and Doyle's yard with the elevated bed and the squirrel problem that had never resolved. She thought about a dog sitting down in a hospital waiting room and refusing to move. She thought about the specific weight of being seen by something that remembers what you taught it and carries it forward without being asked. She thought, that's all any of us can do. Teach what we know. Leave it somewhere it will last. Trust that the right thing will recognize it when the time comes. She picked up Clara. She stood. She went inside.